Hello, I'm Arthur Reed. Welcome to the World War II History Channel, where we explore the pivotal moments and untold stories of the greatest generation. Even the darkest rooms in the world cannot stop a single, quiet thought from taking root. Imagine a grand, sweeping hallway, its floors polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the cold, sharp lines of the world above it. The air in this place is heavy, perfectly still, and smells faintly of wool uniforms, leather boots, and the sharp tang of fresh ink on heavy paper. It is a place of absolute order. A place where every shadow is meticulously planned, and every footstep rings out with a terrifying, rhythmic certainty. This is the heart of the Black Order, a towering fortress of ideology where doubt is considered a disease, and humanity is something to be carefully, deliberately unlearned. But beneath that heavy wool uniform, beneath the silver insignia that catches the harsh artificial light, there is a chest that rises and falls with the quiet, uncertain rhythm of a human heart. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but in the silent, suffocating space behind a man's eyes. He sits at a massive oak desk. The wood is cool beneath his fingertips. Spread out before him are papers, endless stacks of documents, lists of names, and sweeping directives that shape the fate of millions. For years, he looked at these papers and saw only geometry. He saw logistics, he saw duty, he saw the grand, sweeping narrative he had been taught since he was young. He was a perfect piece of a perfect machine, moving exactly as he was designed to move. But then, one quiet afternoon, the machine inside him simply stopped. It wasn't a sudden explosion of rebellion. It was much softer than that. It was the way the late afternoon sun slanted through the tall, narrow windows, catching a swirl of dust motes dancing in the air. He watched them drift, so fragile, so entirely free from the rigid lines of his world. And as he looked down at the paper in his hand, the geometry dissolved. The names were no longer just ink on a page. Suddenly, with a rushing, quiet horror, he saw them as people. He saw hands that tended gardens. He saw mothers folding linen. He saw fathers reading bedtime stories in the soft, golden light of their own homes. A profound and terrifying cold washed over him. The uniform he wore, once a source of deep, unspoken pride, suddenly felt like a cage woven from iron. He swallowed hard, the sound impossibly loud in the empty office. He carefully placed the pen down on the desk. To anyone else, he looked completely composed. His posture was perfectly straight, his expression an emotionless mask. But inside, the world was quietly, catastrophically ending. The realization of what he was a part of the true nature of the shadows that surrounded him, crept into his bones like a winter chill. From that day forward, his life became an exhausting, silent performance. Every morning, he would stand before the mirror in his small, impeccably neat quarters. He would button his shirt, tie his collar, and slip on the jacket that carried the weight of the regime. He would look into his own eyes, searching for the man he used to be, but finding only a frightened stranger staring back. He had to meticulously construct a mask before he even turned the doorknob to leave his room. Walking down the corridors, he would exchange the required salutes. He would nod at his superiors. He would make the correct, rigid small talk in the mess hall. He learned to control the microscopic movements of his face. If a cruel joke was made, he forced the corners of his mouth to lift in a hollow smile. If a boast about a recent, devastating victory was shared, he nodded with feigned enthusiasm. Every interaction was a minefield. A single misplaced sigh, a downward glance lasting a second too long, a hesitation before agreeing, any of these tiny human fractures could mean his end. The paranoia became a living, breathing thing that walked beside him. It sat with him while he ate, it stood in the corner of his room while he tried to sleep. The nights were the hardest. The world outside his window would finally quiet down, the rhythmic marching in the courtyard replaced by the soft whistling of the wind. He would lie in his narrow bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, listening to the frantic, irregular beating of his own heart. He thought of his childhood, of the rolling green hills near his village, of the smell of rain on the cobblestones. He thought of his mother, humming softly as she worked in the kitchen, a gentle, simple life that felt like it belonged to another universe entirely. He wondered how he had drifted so far from that warmth, how he had allowed himself to be swallowed by the cold, mechanical beast that now ruled his country. He began to quietly hoard small moments of humanity, tiny acts of invisible resistance that kept his soul from entirely turning to ash. When no one was looking, he would deliberately misfile a document that might bring harm to an innocent family, sliding it into a forgotten drawer where it would gather dust. He would soften his tone when speaking to the terrified clerks who brought him his coffee, offering a gentle nod instead of a sharp command. These were invisible victories, whispers against a roaring tempest, but they were all he had. They were the oxygen he breathed in a room rapidly running out of air. He was living a life entirely in the shadows, fighting a deeply personal, hidden battle where the stakes were his very soul. It is a lonely thing, to carry the weight of a secret war inside your own mind, knowing that the history books will only ever record the loud, visible clashes, while the most desperate struggles happen quietly, behind closed doors. Thinking about his silent rebellion reminds me of how much of our past is shaped by things we cannot see. History isn't just the roar of the front lines, it is often the quiet, invisible choices made by people hiding in plain sight. If you find yourself drawn to these hidden stories, I would love to share something special with you. I write a free email newsletter where we explore these quiet, forgotten corners of the past. When you join, I'll send you a free ebook called The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, and every week, we'll take a gentle, deep dive into stories of espionage, hidden heroes, and the secrets that changed the world. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is a quiet community of history lovers, and I would be honored to have you join us. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of his secret began to take a physical toll. He lost his appetite. The rich, heavy meals served in the officer's dining room tasted like ash in his mouth. Dark circles bloomed beneath his eyes, and he found his hands trembling slightly when he held his morning coffee. He tried to hide the tremors by gripping his mug tightly, his knuckles turning white. He knew he could not sustain this performance forever. The mask was cracking, and the light of his awakened conscience was threatening to shine through. One evening, he was tasked with drafting a series of letters to the families of soldiers who had fallen. The official language was sterile, full of grand words about sacrifice and duty and the glorious destiny of the nation. It was designed to comfort through pride, to replace grief with a cold, hard patriotism. As he wrote, his pen scratching loudly in the silent office, he felt a tear slip down his cheek, splashing silently onto the thick paper, blurring the sharp ink. He stared at the blurred word. It was a ruin of a word now, soft and messy and undeniably human. He quickly blotted it away, terrified that someone might walk in and see this evidence of his weakness. But in that moment, staring at the stain on the paper, the final, terrifying realization settled into his bones. He could not stay. To stay meant to slowly die inside, to let the last flickering embers of his humanity be snuffed out by the cold winds of the Black Order. To stay meant becoming the very monster he now recognized in the faces of his superiors. But to leave meant walking into an abyss. It meant abandoning his country, his family, his language, his name. It meant becoming a hunted man, a ghost fleeing from the most efficient, ruthless hunting dogs the world had ever known. He walked over to the tall window and looked out into the night. The courtyard below was bathed in the harsh, silver light of the moon. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, closing his eyes, letting the chill seep into his skin. He imagined the vast, dark forests that lay beyond the compound walls. He imagined the treacherous borders, the endless miles of unfamiliar roads, the cold, unforgiving sea. He took a slow, deep breath. The air leaving his lungs sounded like a quiet surrender, but in truth, it was the very first breath of a terrifying, beautiful freedom. The decision was no longer a choice, it was a necessity. The fracture had happened, the glass had shattered, and there was no putting the pieces back together. He would have to gather his secrets, gather his courage, and step off the edge of the world he knew, hoping against all odds that he would not fall, but fly. The shadows in the room seemed to lean in, listening, waiting. But for the first time in years, he did not feel afraid of them. The deepest, darkest part of the night had arrived, and as he turned away from the window and looked back at his empty desk, he knew that the only way to find the morning was to walk straight into the dark. A single breath, held in the quiet dark, can be the heaviest burden a human heart ever has to carry. When you have made the silent, terrifying choice to walk away from the only world you know, the very air around you seems to change. It thickens. The grand, echoing hallways of the Black Order, once a place of terrifying certainty, slowly transform into a labyrinth of glass, where one wrong step, one misplaced glance, could shatter everything. He had made his choice, quietly, invisibly, in the deepest sanctuary of his own mind. But a choice is only a ghost until it is given shape, until it is given weight. And so began the agonizing, delicate art of the fracture. He could not simply walk out the front gates. He was surrounded by men trained to hunt shadows, men who could smell fear on the wind. He needed to build a bridge out of this darkness, and he had to build it piece by piece, using only the thinnest slips of paper. To buy his freedom, he needed secrets. Not grand, sweeping military plans, but the quiet, bureaucratic currency of life and death in the regime. Travel permits. Identification papers with blank spaces waiting for a name. Travel passes bearing the heavy, dark blue ink of official stamps. He needed to become a ghost before he ever left the building. The fear was a physical thing now, a constant, dull ache just beneath his ribs. Every day, he went to work and sat at his immaculate wooden desk. He smiled softly at the clerks, he drank his bitter coffee, he nodded in agreement to the harsh words of his superiors. But beneath the edge of the desk, his hands would sometimes tremble, just for a moment, before he forced them still. He learned to steal time in fragments. A superior officer would turn away to look out the window, and in that span of 3 heartbeats, his hand would glide across the desk, slipping a blank transit document beneath his own sleeve. The crinkle of the stiff paper against his skin felt as loud as thunder. He was certain everyone in the room could hear it. He was certain the man next to him could hear the frantic, uneven rhythm of his pulse. But the officer would turn back, the conversation would continue, and he would sit there, nodding, feeling the dangerous, beautiful weight of that paper hidden against his arm. He became a hoarder of tiny salvations. In his small, sparse quarters, under the cover of the midnight darkness, he would carefully pry up a loose floorboard near the head of his bed. There, in a small velvet pouch that once held his grandfather's pocket watch, he began to gather his new life. A forged signature here. A carefully replicated stamp there. A few precious coins saved from his rations. Every time he lifted that floorboard, he knew he was holding his own life in his hands. If the room were ever searched, if the laundress noticed a smudge of unfamiliar ink on his cuffs, if he spoke in his sleep, it would all be over. The tension was an ocean, and he was swimming in it, miles from the shore, with no light to guide him. He found himself struggling to sleep. The nights were too quiet, allowing the voice in his head to grow dangerously loud. He would lie awake, watching the moonlight crawl across the ceiling, thinking about the life he was leaving behind. He thought of his sister. He remembered a summer afternoon many years ago, long before uniforms and insignias had taken over their world. They had been sitting under a great oak tree, eating apples, watching the clouds drift like lazy sheep across a brilliant blue sky. She had laughed at a joke he made, a clear, ringing sound full of absolute innocence. He missed that sound. He missed the boy who could make her laugh like that. He realized, with a quiet, profound grief, that even if he survived this escape, he could never go back to that tree. He could never go back to her. The man who was leaving was not the boy who had sat in the grass. He was staying now. He had stood by while terrible things happened in the shadows, and the only way to wash his hands was to disappear completely. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, he would light a single candle and write letters to her. He poured all his sorrow, all his fear, and all his love onto the page. He wrote about the coldness of the men he worked with, the terror that gripped him when he looked in the mirror, and his desperate, foolish hope that he might find a quiet corner of the world where nobody knew his name. He would write until his hand ached, until the candle burned down to a stub, sputtering in its pool of wax. And then, with tears blurring his vision, he would hold the corner of the letter to the dying flame. He would watch the paper curl and blacken, watching his words turn to ash and float away into the dark air of his room. He could not leave a trail. His love had to remain as invisible as his rebellion. It takes a profound, almost unimaginable kind of strength to dismantle your own life so quietly. Finding these stories, blowing the dust off these hidden moments of private torment and quiet. Resilience is a deeply moving journey. It requires sifting through the forgotten corners of the past to understand the tremendous weight carried by ordinary human hearts. I spend countless quiet hours researching and piecing these delicate histories together so that they are never lost to time. If you find peace and value in these stories, and if you would like to help keep this history alive, I would be incredibly grateful if you considered leaving a small tip on my Ko-Fi page. Even the smallest gesture helps support the massive time it takes to craft these gently whispered memories. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Knowing there is a community of kind souls listening in the dark makes all this work truly meaningful. The days dragged on, each one feeling longer and heavier than the last. He moved through his duties like a sleepwalker, painfully hyper-aware of everything around him. He noticed the way the leather of a holster creaked when a guard shifted his weight. He noticed the exact, metallic click of the heavy doors locking at sunset. He was mapping his cage, feeling for the weak points in the iron. He needed one final piece to complete his puzzle, an authorization code that would allow him to board a train heading west, toward the misty, ambiguous borders. It was a code kept in a heavily guarded ledger, accessible only to a select few. The opportunity came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The sky outside was a bruised, heavy purple, and the rain lashed against the tall windows, blurring the rigid edges of the courtyard. The officer who held the ledger was called away abruptly, distracted by a sudden, urgent telephone call. He left the ledger open on his desk, the pages fluttering slightly in the draft. This was the moment. The final fracture. He stood up from his own desk. His legs felt like lead. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to sit back down, to close his eyes, to endure the safety of the dark. But he forced himself to walk. One step. Then another. The sound of the rain against the glass covered the soft scuff of his boots on the floor. He reached the officer's desk. He didn't breathe. He didn't blink. He simply looked down at the open page, his eyes scanning the rows of neat, typed numbers. There it was. The sequence of digits that held the key to the rest of his life. He didn't write it down, he couldn't risk carrying the evidence. He simply stared at it, carving the numbers into the deepest part of his memory, repeating them over and over in his mind like a desperate prayer. As the officer's footsteps echoed in the hallway, returning to the room, he slipped smoothly back to his own desk, picking up his pen just as the door handle turned. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. But as he looked down at the document in front of him, he realized something miraculous. The fear, the paralyzing, suffocating terror that had lived with him for so long, was beginning to change. It was no longer a weight holding him down. It was a current, pulling him forward. That night, He lifted the loose floorboard for the very last time. He took out the small velvet pouch and laid his gathered treasures on the bed. The forged passes, the stolen stamps, the blank identity papers. They were nothing but scraps of paper, fragile and easily destroyed. But to him, they were a bridge made of light. He carefully packed them into the lining of a small leather satchel. He folded his civilian clothes, garments that smelled faintly of cedar and a life he barely remembered. He did not pack anything that bore the insignia of the Black Order. He wanted to leave every piece of that cold, metal world behind him. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed, staring at the satchel. The room was perfectly still. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a thick, heavy fog was rolling in, wrapping the compound in a soft, gray blanket. It was the perfect weather for ghosts. It was the perfect weather for a man who needed to disappear. He closed his eyes and took a long, slow breath. The fracture was complete. The bridge was built. All that was left to do was to wait for the sun to set one last time, to wait for the deepest, quietest shadow of the night, and finally, to step off the edge of the world. There is a specific, heavy kind of silence that falls only when you are leaving your entire life behind. It is the silence of a breath held tightly in the chest, the quiet pause between the person you have always been and the phantom you are about to become. The heavy oak door of the compound clicked shut behind him, a sound so terribly soft, yet in his mind, it echoed like the closing of a heavy iron vault. He stood on the damp cobblestones, the mist curling around his ankles, and for a long moment, he simply stared at the fog pressing in from the dark. The air outside the walls tasted different. It tasted of wet earth, of distant wood smoke, and of the terrifying, beautiful unknown. He adjusted the collar of his civilian coat, pulling it up against the chill. The fabric felt foreign against his neck. For years, he had been encased in the stiff, scratchy wool of the regime, a uniform that dictated exactly who he was, how he stood, and who he was supposed to hate. Now, in this simple, worn overcoat, he was just a man in the night. But shedding the uniform did not immediately shed the fear. He began to walk. The street lamps were hooded, casting only meager, watery pools of yellow light onto the wet street. He stayed in the shadows, his footsteps carefully measured. He told himself not to rush. A man running in the dark is a man with a secret, and he needed to look like a man who belonged exactly where he was. He forced his breathing to slow, matching the steady, rhythmic scuff of his boots against the stones. Every shadow seemed to breathe. Every rusted creak of a swinging sign above a closed shop made his heart leap into his throat. He imagined the officers back in the compound, imagined the exact moment someone would look for him, the moment the alarm would finally tear the night apart. But the night remained whole. The night, it seemed, was willing to keep his secret for a little while longer. The train station emerged from the fog like a sleeping iron beast. Plumes of white steam hissed from the underbelly of waiting engines, mingling with the thick gray air. It was a cathedral of transit, a place where destinies crossed and unraveled. Even at this hour, it was filled with shadows. Soldiers heading to the front, leaning wearily against their canvas packs. Families huddled together, their faces painted with the silent, exhausted grief of prolonged farewells. He moved through the concourse like a ghost. He kept his head bowed, his eyes fixed on the floor, letting his hat cast a deep shadow over his face. In his pocket, his fingers tightly gripped a small rectangle of stiff paper. His forged transit pass. His ticket to the unknown. He had stared at it so many times in his dim room, memorizing the false name, the fake destination, the carefully replicated official stamps. Now, as he approached the platform checkpoint, it felt as heavy as a stone. The guard at the gate looked tired. He was older, his face lined with the deep exhaustion that the war had carved into the bones of the entire country. The guard held out a gloved hand. This was the moment. The threshold. He handed over the paper. His hand did not shake. The terror inside him was absolute, but he had buried it so deep that the surface of his skin remained perfectly still. The guard glanced at the pass, then briefly up at his face. For a single heartbeat, the world stopped spinning. The steam ceased to hiss. The murmur of the crowd faded to nothing. He prepared himself for the shout, for the hands grabbing his arms, for the sudden end to his fragile dream. But the guard merely blinked, his eyes unfocused, looking right through him. A heavy stamp came down on the paper with a dull, indifferent thud. The guard handed it back, already looking at the next person in line. He walked past the gate. The relief was so sudden, so immense, that his knees briefly turned to water. He had to reach out and steady himself against the cold, damp iron of a pillar. He closed his eyes and allowed himself one long, trembling breath. He was through. The carriage he boarded was dimly lit and smelled of stale tobacco and wet wool. He found a seat in the corner, pressing his shoulder against the cold glass of the window. Around him, people settled into their own private miseries. A woman opposite him clutched a worn, wooden rosary. A young boy slept with his head resting on a canvas sack. No one looked at him. No one cared who he was. In this small, rattling wooden box, they were all simply travelers trying to survive the night. With a profound, jarring lurch, the train began to move. The hiss of steam grew louder, and the slow, rhythmic groan of metal on metal filled the carriage. As they pulled out of the station, the faint yellow lights of the platform slid past the window, moving faster and faster until they blurred into a continuous ribbon, and then vanished entirely into the dark. He was moving. He was actually leaving. The rhythmic clatter of the tracks beneath him felt like a lullaby he had forgotten. Clack, 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 clack. It was the sound of distance. It was the sound of miles being placed between his fragile beating heart and the cold, unyielding machinery of the Black Order. As the city fell away, replaced by the deep, ink-black silhouettes of the forests and fields, he realized the profound gravity of what he was running from. He was not just fleeing a building or a uniform. He was fleeing a reality so horrific, so devoid of human light, that the very memory of it felt like a stain on his soul. The regime he left behind operated in the shadows, hiding its true face behind grand parades and carefully curated propaganda. The ordinary citizens sleeping in the towns they rumbled past did not know what he knew. They did not see the things he had seen. Sometimes, history is too dark to be captured in the bright pages of textbooks. The true, unfiltered reality of what this man was escaping, the raw, undeniable cost of such unchecked hatred, is something that is often hidden away, considered too intense for polite conversation. But to truly understand the depth of his desperate flight, to feel the profound weight of his relief, we must sometimes acknowledge the darkest corners of what he fled. I have gathered a collection of unseen, raw, and completely uncensored media from the war, images and footage that reveal the harsh, unvarnished truth of the era, the things the regime tried to keep hidden. Because this material is too sensitive for regular platforms, I keep it secured on a private Gumroad page for those who wish to look history directly in the eye, without any filters. It is a sobering, powerful way to honor the reality of the past. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the hours drifted on, the carriage grew colder. The rhythmic swaying of the train began to untie the tight, fearful knots in his muscles. He rested his head against the glass. The condensation from his breath fogged the window, blurring the dark shapes of the world rushing by outside. He reached into his pocket and traced the outline of his ticket once more. The fake name printed on it felt less like a lie now, and more like a promise. It was a blank canvas. He wondered what kind of man this new name belonged to. He decided that this new man would be quiet. He decided that this new man would be kind, that he would speak softly, and that he would never, ever wear a uniform again. He watched a tiny droplet of water slide slowly down the cold pane of glass, tracing a jagged, uncertain path through the fog. He felt a tear mirror its journey down his own cheek. He did not wipe it away. For the first time in years, he did not have to hide his sorrow. He mourned the boy he had once been. He mourned the family he would never write to again. He mourned the country he was leaving behind, a country he had once loved before the darkness swallowed it whole. But beneath the grief, a tiny, unfamiliar warmth began to flicker in his chest. It was a fragile, trembling thing, easily extinguished, but it was there. Hope. He was hurtling through the pitch-black night, carrying nothing but a stolen identity, a few crumpled notes, and the heavy burden of his memories. He did not know where the train would ultimately leave him. He did not know if the border patrols would catch him before he reached the coast. He did not know how he would cross the cold, unforgiving sea that lay ahead. But as the deep blue hues of pre-dawn began to softly bruise the eastern horizon, revealing the mist clinging to the rolling, unfamiliar countryside, he closed his eyes and listened to the steady beating of the wheels. He was a fugitive. He was a traitor to a terrible cause. But for the very first time in his life, he was free. Water has no memory, but it holds the quiet secrets of every desperate soul who has ever crossed it in the dark. When you reach the edge of the land, you reach the absolute limit of the world you have always known. For days, he had moved through the shadows of the continent like a ghost, a phantom slipping past train conductors, avoiding the cold stares of men in uniforms he once wore. He had followed the rivers, he had hidden in the damp straw of anonymous barns, and he had let the rhythmic, rattling hum of the railways carry him north, always north, until the air itself began to change. It lost the smell of pine trees and factory smoke. It grew sharp, biting, and heavy with salt. He stood at the end of a forgotten, crumbling stone pier, the collar of his thin civilian coat turned up against the wind. Before him lay the sea. It was not the gentle, sparkling blue ocean of childhood stories. It was a vast, bruised expanse of churning gray and black, violently alive, tossing its freezing white crests into the misty air. The sheer size of it was terrifying. On the continent, he could hide behind walls, he could blend into a crowd, he could use the geometry of the cities to shield him. But out there, on that dark water, there was nowhere to hide. You were entirely at the mercy of the deep. In the shadows beneath the pier, a small, weather-beaten fishing boat bobbed restlessly against the wet ropes. It smelled of spilled diesel, rotting wood, and ancient canvas. It was a fragile, ugly little thing, but to him, it was an ark. The captain was an old man with eyes like chipped flint, a man who had long ago stopped asking questions about the shadows that came seeking passage in the dead of night. They did not speak. Words were dangerous, and they were useless here. The fugitive simply reached into the lining of his coat and produced the heavy gold pocket watch that had belonged to his father. He placed it in the captain's rough, calloused palm. The old man closed his fingers over the gold, gave a single, imperceptible nod, and turned back to the coughing engine. He stepped over the side of the boat, his boots slipping on the slick wooden deck. As he moved toward the stern, he realized he was not alone. Huddled in the cramped, freezing space beneath the tarpaulin were three other shapes. They were just silhouettes in the gloom, a mother pulling a coarse wool blanket tightly around a young child, and an older man staring blankly at the rusted floorboards. Like him, they had shed their names. Like him, they were running from the heavy, iron grip of the continent. The engine gave a deep, rattling shudder, and the small boat pulled away from the stones. There is a profound, terrifying moment when the land finally disappears into the fog. He watched the faint, yellow glow of the coastal lamps grow dimmer and dimmer until they were swallowed entirely by the mist. He was unmoored. The solid ground, the earth that held his history, his language, and his sins, was gone. He was suspended in an endless, shifting void. He was no longer a soldier of the Black Order, but he was not yet a survivor. He was a man held in limbo, a breath trapped halfway in the chest. The journey was a slow, freezing agony. The wind howled across the open water, tearing at the canvas above them. The boat pitched and rolled, lifting them high onto the crests of black waves before dropping them into the terrifying, breathless troughs. The freezing spray soaked through his coat, chilling his bones, turning his hands stiff and clumsy. He pulled his knees to his chest, closing his eyes, trying to find a warm place inside his own mind to hide. In the darkest hours of the crossing, when the cold was so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest, he felt a gentle nudge against his arm. He opened his eyes. The older man sitting across from him, a man whose face was lined with a lifetime of quiet sorrows, was holding out a battered tin flask. His hand was trembling from the cold, but his eyes were soft. He didn't ask who the fugitive was. He didn't ask what terrible things he might be running from, or what uniform he might have once worn. In this tiny, fragile boat, tossed about on the terrifying sea, none of that mattered. They were just two freezing human beings, clinging to life in the dark. He took the flask. The metal was cold, but the liquid inside was a harsh, burning brandy that sent a sudden, brilliant line of warmth down his throat. He handed it back with a slow, grateful nod. A silent communion. A small, perfect moment of grace amidst the terror. Sitting in that cold boat, surrounded by strangers who shared his silent terror, he realized that history isn't just made by loud nations and grand armies. It is carried by ordinary people seeking connection in the absolute darkest of places. Finding those connections, looking deeply into the raw, unfiltered stories of human endurance, is what truly brings the past to life. If you find comfort in these deep dives, and uncovering the layers of history that we rarely get to see in textbooks, I have created a quiet, dedicated corner just for us on Patreon. There, we share free podcasts, raw, unblurred sections of history, and gather together as a warm community of history lovers who appreciate the quiet truth. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Joining us there is a beautiful way to help keep these fragile, human stories from fading into the mist. As the endless night wore on, he began to drift into a strange, exhausted fever dream. The rhythmic thumping of the diesel engine sounded like a giant, mechanical heart. He dreamed of his mother's kitchen, the smell of baking bread, the warm, golden light spilling across the wooden table. He dreamed of the heavy oak doors of the Black Order, locking shut behind him forever. He dreamed of falling into the black water, sinking down into the quiet deep, where there were no wars, no ideologies, no right or wrong. But the sea did not take him. Very slowly, the absolute blackness of the sky began to soften. It turned a deep, bruised purple, then a pale, icy blue. The wind began to lose its terrifying edge, settling into a steady, bitter breeze. He opened his eyes, his eyelashes heavy with salt. The other passengers were stirring, looking out over the edge of the boat with a desperate, quiet hunger. He pulled himself up, his muscles aching, his joints stiff with the cold. He looked out over the bow. The thick morning fog was rolling over the water in slow, graceful waves. And then, as if a curtain were being gently pulled aside, the mist parted. There, resting on the horizon like a sleeping gray giant, was a jagged line of stone. Land. It was not his home. It was the land of the enemy. It was an island heavily fortified, filled with people who were trained to hate everything he came from, people who listened to the radio every night and prayed for the destruction of his homeland. If they knew who he was, if they knew the secrets he carried and the uniform he had worn, they would lock him away in the dark forever. Yet, as he stared at those distant, pale cliffs emerging from the morning light, he felt a profound, overwhelming wave of relief wash over him. His chest heaved, and he had to grip the wooden rail to keep his hands from shaking. The sea had washed away his footprints. The ocean had been a brutal, terrifying barrier, but it had also been a baptism. The man who had walked onto the pier on the continent was gone, swallowed by the cold water. The man who was about to step onto this new, foreign soil was a blank page. He was a ghost, exhausted, freezing, and entirely alone, but he was alive. The engine slowed to a gentle, throbbing hum as the boat navigated the rocky shallows. The water here was calmer, a pale, milky green under the rising sun. He could see the intricate details of the cliffs now, the tufts of dark green grass clinging to the stone, the gentle curve of a hidden cove waiting to receive them. He took a deep breath. The air smelled of wet earth and rain. It smelled like a beginning. The boat drifted closer to the shadows of the shore, gliding silently through the calm water, carrying its fragile cargo of secrets and hopes toward the quiet, waiting stones. The earth beneath your feet feels entirely different when it is the very place you were once taught to destroy. The small, battered fishing boat finally scraped against the rough shingle of the English coastline, the sound of wood dragging over pebbles echoing softly in the thick, damp fog of the early morning. He stepped over the side, his boots sinking slightly into the wet, shifting stones. The sea, which had been a roaring, terrifying monster all through the night, now simply lapped quietly at his heels, as if its job was done. He stood there for a long moment, the mist swirling around his damp coat, listening to the fading hum of the boat's engine as it melted back into the gray void, leaving him entirely alone. He was breathing deeply, taking in the scent of this new world. It did not smell like the continent. It did not smell of the dense, dark pine forests of his youth, nor did it carry the sharp, metallic tang of the sprawling military compounds he had fled. Here, the air was heavy with the scent of wet chalk, decaying kelp, and a deep, earthy dampness that seemed to settle right into his bones. It was a gentle, sleepy smell. But inside his chest, his heart was beating with the frantic, trapped rhythm of a hunted bird. He had crossed the water. He had escaped the reach of the Black Order. Yet, as he looked up at the towering, pale cliffs rising like ghosts from the morning mist, a new and terrible realization washed over him. He had traded one danger for another. He was now a phantom walking behind enemy lines. Every single person on this island was his adversary. If they knew the uniform he had worn, if they knew the insignia that had once been pinned to his collar, they would not see a frightened, exhausted man seeking refuge. They would see a monster. He began to walk, moving away from the water and up a narrow, winding path that cut through the chalky rock. His legs felt like lead, heavy with the exhaustion of sleepless nights and absolute terror. As he climbed, the landscape slowly began to reveal itself. It was wildly different from the rigid, meticulously ordered world he had left behind. The lanes were narrow and overgrown, framed by thick, untamed hedges of hawthorn and blackberry brambles. Great, ancient oak trees leaned lazily over the road, their branches dripping with morning dew. There was a profound, stoic quietness to this place. He had expected the air to be thick with the tension of war, but here in the rural, misty countryside, the war felt like a distant, muffled storm. It was there, hidden in the shadows, but life simply carried on around it. He heard the distant, melodic tolling of a church bell, a soft, slow sound that spoke of centuries of unbroken routine. Eventually, the winding lane opened up to a small, coastal railway station. It was built of red brick, softened by creeping ivy, its platform slick with rain. He stopped at the edge of the trees, his breath catching in his throat. There were people here. Just a few, ordinary people going about their morning. A man in a flat cap reading a newspaper. A woman sweeping the platform with a slow, rhythmic motion. For the first time since he had discarded his uniform, he felt intensely, agonizingly visible. He felt as though the black fabric and silver runes were still burning like a brand upon his skin, shining through his worn civilian coat. He reached into his pocket, his trembling fingers tracing the edges of his forged identity papers. The fake name, the fabricated history, it all felt dangerously fragile, a paper shield against a world of sharp edges. He forced himself to walk toward the platform. Every step required a conscious, immense effort of will. He had to remember not to march. He had to let his shoulders slump just a little, to drag his feet slightly, to walk like an ordinary, tired man, and not like a soldier of the regime. He kept his head bowed, pulling his hat down low to cast a shadow over his eyes. As he stepped onto the platform, he noticed a small wooden cart selling tea. The morning air was bitterly cold, and the steam rising from the large metal urn looked like a tiny, miraculous cloud of warmth. His body ached for it. He approached the cart, his heart hammering against his ribs, terrified that his accent, his mannerisms, or simply the fear in his eyes would give him away. The woman behind the cart was older, wearing a thick woolen shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her face was deeply lined, carrying that same universal exhaustion he had seen on the faces of people across Europe. She didn't ask him any questions. She simply looked at his shivering frame, reached for a chipped ceramic cup, and poured it full of dark, steaming tea, adding a generous splash of milk. She held it out to him. As he took it, his fingers brushed against hers. Her hands were warm and rough from work. She offered him a small, weary smile, a smile of pure, uncomplicated human kindness. He nodded in thanks, terrified to speak, afraid that the sharp consonants of his native tongue would shatter the illusion. He wrapped both his frozen hands around the chipped cup, feeling the heat bleed into his palms. He walked over to a quiet wooden bench and sat down, staring at the swirling surface of the tea. A profound, confusing sorrow washed over him. This woman, whose sons were perhaps at this very moment fighting his former comrades, had just offered him warmth and a gentle smile. She had seen a cold stranger and offered comfort. The cognitive dissonance was almost too much to bear. He had been taught that these people were the enemy, that they were different, that they were something to be conquered. Yet here, holding a warm cup on a rainy platform, the grand, terrible ideologies of the war dissolved into absolute nothingness. There was only the cold morning, the hot tea, and the shared, quiet struggle of simply getting through the day. As he held that chipped ceramic cup, feeling the rough texture of the glaze beneath his fingertips, he realized how deeply history is anchored in the physical things we touch. It is not just sweeping borders and grand speeches, it is in the fabric of a coat, the faded ink of a returned letter, the comforting weight of a simple teacup. Holding onto these tangible pieces of the past helps us remember the real, breathing human beings who lived through those unimaginable times. If you feel drawn to connecting with the past in a visual, physical way, I often recommend exploring the incredible WWII memorabilia available on Amazon, or even immersing yourself in the visual history of the era by watching beautifully crafted films like Midway on Prime. It is a profound way to honor the past and feel the weight of the history we share. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. When the train finally arrived, it came with a hiss of steam and a slow, grinding screech of metal. He boarded silently, finding an empty compartment near the back. The carriage smelled of damp wool, pipe tobacco, and wet newspaper. As the train lurched forward, slowly pulling away from the coast and moving deeper into the heart of the English countryside, he leaned his head against the cold glass of the window. The landscape rolling by was a patchwork of muted greens, browns, and soft grays. It was beautiful, but it was not his home. He watched a flock of birds rise from a field, turning together in the gray sky like a handful of thrown ash. He was safe, for now. The immediate terror of the crossing had faded, but it was quickly being replaced by a deep, hollow ache of isolation. To survive, he had to erase himself completely. He could never send a letter to his mother to tell her he was alive. He could never speak of his childhood, of the rolling hills where he grew up, or the songs he used to sing. Every memory he held had to be locked away in the darkest corner of his mind. He was a man wearing a mask, and the mask was incredibly heavy. He watched the people in the corridor walking past his compartment. A young mother with a sleeping infant. An elderly man leaning heavily on a walking stick. They looked right past him, He was a ghost, haunting a world that did not know he was there. The sheer, overwhelming loneliness of it pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. By the time the train finally ground to a halt at a small, inland village station, the early winter sun had already slipped below the horizon. The village was cloaked in the heavy, necessary darkness of the blackout. There were no street lamps, no glowing windows to offer comfort. Just the shadowy outlines of stone cottages and the sound of the wind rushing through the bare branches of the trees. He found his way to a modest boarding house on the edge of the village, a place that advertised cheap rooms with a small, hand-painted sign swinging faintly in the breeze. The landlady, a stern but tired-looking woman, took his forged ration book and his fake name without a second glance. She handed him an iron key and pointed him toward the stairs. His room was small, tucked tightly under the sloping eaves of the roof. It held only a narrow iron bed, a washstand, and a single wooden chair. But to him, it felt like a sanctuary. He closed the door and turned the key in the lock. The click echoed loudly in the quiet room. He stood in the center of the floor and slowly, painfully, began to shed his damp coat. He placed his hat on the chair. He walked over to the small, cracked mirror hanging above the washstand and looked at his own reflection in the dim, watery light of the moon slipping through a gap in the curtains. He looked incredibly old. His eyes were deeply shadowed, and his face was hollowed out by fear and exhaustion. He reached up and touched his own cheek, tracing the lines that the last few weeks had carved into his skin. He wondered if he would ever recognize himself again. He wondered if the man he used to be was truly dead, left behind in the dark corridors of the Black Order, or if he was still in there somewhere, hiding behind the fear. He moved to the narrow bed and lay down. The mattress was thin, the blankets rough, but he did not care. Outside, it began to rain again, a soft, steady patter against the slate roof just inches above his head. It was a gentle, lulling sound. He closed his eyes. He was in a strange bed, in a strange house, in a country that considered him a monster. But he was breathing. The quiet resilience of the human spirit is a profound thing. It can endure the crushing weight of empires, it can cross treacherous, freezing seas, and it can find a way to rest, even when the soul is fractured. As the rain fell softly over the sleepy English village, washing the foreign soil outside his window, he let out a long, slow breath, and finally, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he slept. There is a strange, delicate kind of mercy in the sound of rain falling on an unfamiliar roof. It was the first thing he heard as he slowly surfaced from a deep, exhausted sleep. The rain in this valley did not storm or rage. It did not carry the violent, biting chill of the harsh winters back on the continent. Instead, it was a soft, steady weeping, a quiet drumbeat against the ancient slate tiles just inches above his head. He lay perfectly still in the narrow iron bed, the rough woolen blanket pulled up to his chin, listening. For the first time in years, he was not listening for the sharp bark of a command, or the heavy, rhythmic thud of marching boots in a stone courtyard. He was just listening to the rain. He opened his eyes. The light filtering through the small, dormer window was a muted, watery gray. It was the color of old silver, casting long, gentle shadows across the wooden floorboards of his tiny rented room. He breathed in, deeply and slowly. The air in the room was cold, but it smelled of lavender soap, old timber, and the faint, sweet scent of chimney smoke drifting down from the village above. It was a smell of profound, deeply rooted domesticity. It was a smell that had absolutely no place in a war. Slowly, carefully, as if moving too quickly might shatter the illusion, he pushed the blanket aside. His bare feet touched the cold, uneven floorboards. He walked over to the small window and wiped away the condensation with the edge of his sleeve, peering out into his new world. Below him lay the village. It was not built in the rigid, sweeping grids of the cities he had known, nor did it have the cold, imposing architecture designed to make a man feel small. This village had grown organically, over centuries, folding itself gently into the curve of the green hills. The cottages were made of rough-hewn stone, their roofs a patchwork of slate and thatch, softened by thick blankets of creeping green moss. A narrow lane, paved with rounded cobblestones, wound its way through the center, shining like a dark river in the damp morning light. It was impossibly, achingly peaceful. The dissonance between the war roaring across the channel and the absolute, sleepy tranquility of this place hit him like a physical blow. He stood there in his simple cotton undershirt, shivering slightly in the cold, feeling a sudden, overwhelming urge to weep. He was an officer of the Black Order, a man who had stood in the very epicenter of the darkest machine the world had ever built, and yet here he was, watching an old black dog slowly wander across a quiet English street, sniffing at a puddle. He dressed slowly, putting on the worn civilian clothes that now constituted his entire identity. A woolen sweater that was slightly too large. A pair of gray trousers. A dark, unremarkable coat. He took his forged ration book and his fake identity papers, placing them securely in his inner pocket. They felt heavy against his chest, a constant, physical reminder of the lie he was living. He walked down the narrow, creaking staircase of the boarding house. The landlady was nowhere to be seen, but a single, chipped mug of lukewarm tea had been left on the hall table for him. A tiny, unspoken gesture of routine. He drank it standing up, the liquid tasting faintly of tannin and tin, but providing a necessary warmth to his stomach. Opening the heavy oak door, he stepped out onto the cobblestones. The rain was little more than a heavy mist now, hanging in the air and settling on his hair and eyelashes like tiny pearls. He began to walk. The village was slowly waking up. He passed a row of low stone walls, admiring the way the damp earth smelled so rich and fertile. He saw a bicycle leaning against a gate, its metal basket holding a damp, folded newspaper. He was walking among the enemy. These were the people his former commanders spoke of with such venom. These were the people the radio broadcasts promised to crush. Yet, as he looked around, he saw only tired, ordinary human beings. He saw an elderly man, his shoulders stooped, carefully sweeping wet autumn leaves from his front step. He saw a young woman in a faded green coat, walking briskly with a woven basket hooked over her arm, her face pale and drawn. The war had taken their young men, it had taken their resources, and it had left them with this quiet, enduring exhaustion. He realized he needed bread. Following the faint, warm scent of yeast, he found his way to a small bakery tucked between two larger houses. The bell above the door gave a cheerful, high-pitched jingle as he pushed it open. The air inside was wonderfully warm, fogging his glasses immediately. It smelled of roasted oats, warm flour, and caramelized sugar. Behind the wooden counter stood a woman. She was perhaps in her late 50s, her graying hair pulled back beneath a white cotton cap, her hands dusted with a fine layer of flour. She looked up as he entered. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. This was the first time he would have to speak, to engage, to be a person in this world. He stepped forward, keeping his head slightly lowered, and gently placed his forged ration book on the counter. The woman looked at the book, then looked at him. Her eyes were a soft, watery blue. She didn't see a fugitive. She didn't see the horrors he was running from. She just saw a quiet man with sad eyes, wearing a coat that was entirely too thin for the weather. "Just the one loaf today, love?" she asked. Her voice was musical, possessing the gentle, rolling accent of the countryside. He nodded slowly, not trusting his voice. "Yes, please," he managed to whisper. The English words felt strange and clumsy on his tongue, but she didn't seem to notice. She turned, retrieved a small, round loaf of dark bread from the wooden shelf, and carefully wrapped it in a piece of brown paper, tying it with a scrap of rough string. She handed it to him, taking the small torn square from his ration book and a few copper coins. "Terrible weather for a walk," she murmured sympathetically, offering a warm, tired smile. "Mind you don't catch a chill." He took the warm bread, his fingers briefly brushing the rough paper. "Thank you," he said softly. and he meant it with every fiber of his being. He thanked her for the bread, he thanked her for the smile, and most of all, he thanked her for simply treating him like a human being. Stepping back out into the mist, the warmth of the bread against his chest felt like a living thing. He walked slowly toward the edge of the village, finding a low stone wall beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree. He sat down, the wet stone cold beneath him, and broke off a piece of the crust. He chewed it slowly, tasting the salt and the yeast, feeling the immense, crushing weight of his reality settle over him. He was perfectly safe in this sleepy village. The people were kind. The rain was gentle. But his mind was an endless battlefield. He could not stop thinking about the continent, about the terrible machinery he had helped to turn, about the millions of lives being crushed in the dark while he sat under a tree eating warm bread. The guilt of his survival was a heavy, suffocating blanket. He realized then that the most profound struggles of the war were not always fought with tanks and artillery. Sometimes, the most desperate battles were fought in complete silence, in the hidden corners of an isolated village, inside the fractured mind of a single man trying to outrun his own shadow. So much of the history we are taught focuses on the deafening roar of the front lines, but the truth is, the war was also shaped by the invisible, the quiet, and the hidden. It was shaped by secrets kept in the dark, by people hiding in plain sight, and by operations so deeply buried that they never made it into the history books. If you are drawn to these hidden narratives, to the quiet shadows where the true shape of history is often forged, I would love to invite you to join my free email newsletter. When you sign up, I will send you a free copy of my ebook, The Shadow War: 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. Every week, we take a gentle, deep dive into stories of espionage, unseen heroes, and the forgotten secrets that changed the world. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is a wonderful community of history lovers, and I would be honored to share these hidden stories with you. He sat under the oak tree for a long time, watching the rain slowly wash the cobblestones of the narrow lane. The water gathered in small, dark pools, reflecting the gray sky above. He thought about his mother. He wondered if she was standing by a window somewhere in Germany, watching this exact same rain fall on her own street. He wondered if she thought he was dead, lost on some frozen battlefield in the east. It broke his heart to know that he could never tell her the truth, that her grief was the price he had to pay for his freedom. To love someone from a distance, across enemy lines, knowing you can never speak their name out loud, is a very specific kind of agony. He held the remaining half of the loaf in his lap, listening to the soft rustle of the wet oak leaves above him. A solitary blackbird landed on the stone wall a few feet away, tilting its head, watching him with bright, intelligent eyes. It gave a short, melodic trill before taking flight again, disappearing into the mist. Eventually, the chill of the damp air seeped through his coat, settling into his bones. He stood up, brushing the crumbs from his trousers, and began the slow walk back to the boarding house. The village remained incredibly quiet. A few more chimneys had begun to smoke, the smell of burning peat and coal mingling with the rain. He felt entirely detached from the world around him, as if he were walking behind a pane of thick glass. He could see the warmth of the village, he could smell the fires and the baking bread, he could hear the distant, muffled voices of children playing indoors, but he could not truly touch any of it. He was a phantom, carrying a darkness that this beautiful, sleepy place could not possibly understand. When he finally returned to his small room under the eaves, the afternoon light was already beginning to fade. He placed the rest of the bread on the washstand. He took off his damp coat and draped it over the wooden chair, hoping it would dry by morning. He sat on the edge of the narrow iron bed, listening as the rain began to fall a little harder against the slate roof. It was a rhythmic, comforting sound. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the cold plaster wall. He was hiding in the very heart of the country that wished for his destruction, surrounded by people who would be entirely justified in turning him in. Yet, he had never felt so strangely, painfully protected. The cobblestones outside would continue to shine in the rain. The village would sleep and wake and carry on its quiet, enduring life, completely unaware of the ghost breathing softly in the room under the roof. He pulled his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around his legs, and let the gentle lullaby of the English rain slowly wash him into sleep. A smile can be the heaviest thing a person ever has to carry. When the sun gently rose over the quiet English valley, washing the slate roofs in a pale, buttery light, the village simply woke up. For the baker, the postman, and the tired mothers tending to their hearths, morning was just a return to the gentle rhythm of their lives. But for the man in the small room under the eaves, morning was the beginning of a profound, exhausting performance. Before he even turned the brass handle of his bedroom door, he had to carefully construct the man he was pretending to be. He would stand before the small, cracked mirror above his washstand, looking at the tired lines around his eyes. He would soften his jaw. He would let his shoulders drop, letting go of the rigid, unnatural posture that had been drilled into his bones by the Black Order. He had to erase the soldier and build the shadow. He practiced his words in the silent room, whispering softly to himself. He focused on softening the harsh, clipped consonants of his native tongue, wrapping them in the slow, rolling cadence of the English countryside. It was a delicate, dangerous dance. Every time he opened his mouth, he risked everything. A single slipped syllable, a momentary lapse in his carefully cultivated accent, could shatter the fragile glass house he was living in. And so, he learned the art of quietness. He became a master of the polite nod, the gentle, noncommittal hum, the warm but distant smile. Walking down the cobblestone lane to purchase his meager daily rations, he felt like an actor pushed onto a stage without a script. He passed the stone cottages, smelling the comforting scent of wood smoke and damp earth. A neighbor, an older man with a woolen cap and a pipe clamped between his teeth, was struggling to push a wooden wheelbarrow full of wet, heavy firewood through a muddy gate. Instinctively, the fugitive stepped forward. He placed his hands on the rough wood of the barrow, lending his strength. Together, they pushed it over the threshold and onto the paved path. The old man paused, taking the pipe from his mouth, and wiped his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He looked at the stranger with eyes that were cloudy but incredibly kind. "Thank you, friend," the old man said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "You've got a good heart in you." The fugitive simply nodded, offering a small, self-deprecating smile, and continued down the lane. But inside, his chest seized with a sudden, suffocating panic. "Friend." The word echoed in his mind, sharp and painful. "You have a good heart." The absolute, tragic irony of it felt like a physical blow. If this kind old man knew the truth, if he knew the uniform this friend used to wear, the ideology he had once belonged to, the shadows he had stood in, the warmth in those cloudy eyes would turn to absolute, terrified hatred. This was the quiet agony of the mask. The village was embracing him, folding him into its gentle, sleepy routine, and every act of kindness they offered felt like a stolen treasure. He was a thief, taking their goodwill, their smiles, and their trust under entirely false pretenses. He wanted so desperately to be the man they saw, a quiet, helpful stranger simply looking for a peaceful life. He wanted to be the man who pushed the wheelbarrow. But the ghost of the man he used to be was always standing just over his shoulder, whispering in the dark. Living a life entirely in secret, constantly maintaining a carefully constructed mask, requires an immense, invisible effort. It is a profound, exhausting labor to hide the truth. In a much different way, it takes a great deal of quiet, invisible labor to bring these hidden truths back into the light. Uncovering these fragile, deeply personal histories, sifting through the forgotten whispers of the past to find the human heart beating beneath it all, is a journey that requires endless hours of careful research and dedication. If you find comfort and value in these softly told stories, and if you would like to help support the massive time it takes to craft them, I would be incredibly grateful if you considered leaving a small tip on my Ko-Fi page. It is a simple gesture that helps keep this quiet history alive. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Knowing there is a community of kind souls out there makes every hour of research truly worthwhile. As the days turned into weeks, the performance began to take a deep, psychological toll. The mask was becoming fused to his skin. He found himself laughing at the grocer's mild jokes, a genuine, warm sound that surprised even him. He would sit on a wooden bench near the village green, watching the few remaining children play with homemade wooden toys, and he would feel a profound, sweeping tenderness for them. He was beginning to love the very people he was deceiving. This love was a terrifying thing. It made his secret infinitely heavier. When he sat by the fire in the small parlor of the boarding house, listening to the landlady knit and hum softly to herself, he felt a desperate, almost unbearable urge to confess. He wanted to fall to his knees on the woven rug, bury his face in his hands, and pour out the whole terrible truth. He wanted to say, "I am not who you think I am. I come from the dark. Please, forgive me." But he knew he could not. Confession might wash his own soul clean, but it would destroy the peace of the people around him. It would bring the war right into their quiet parlor. And so, he chose to carry the burden alone. He swallowed the words, forcing them deep down into his chest, and merely offered the landlady a gentle compliment on her knitting. The evenings were the most difficult part of the performance. When the sun dipped below the hills and the village surrendered to the blackout, the shadows grew long and bold. He would sit at the small wooden desk in his room, lighting a single, flickering candle. He would take out a piece of blank paper and a pen, and he would write letters to the people he had left behind. He wrote to his mother, describing the soft English rain and the smell of the bakery. He wrote to his sister, telling her about the old man with the wheelbarrow and the kindness of the grocer. He poured all of his true feelings, all of his guilt, and all of his complicated, beautiful love onto the page. For a few brief minutes, in the dim golden light of the candle, he allowed himself to take off the mask. He allowed himself to be the frightened, lonely son who just wanted to go home. But the letters could never be sent. They were just ghosts, talking to other ghosts. When the page was full, he would read it over once, tracing the shape of his own name at the bottom, his real name, a name he had not spoken aloud since he crossed the freezing sea. Then, carefully, he would hold the edge of the paper to the candle flame. He would watch the fire eat the words, turning his true self into fragile, black ash. He would crush the ash into dust and let it fall out the small dormer window, carrying his secrets away into the damp night air. He would lie down on his narrow iron bed, staring up at the dark ceiling. The mask was resting on the pillow beside him, waiting to be worn again the moment the sun came up. He wondered, in the deep silence of the room, how long a man could pretend to be someone else before the original man simply ceased to exist. He listened to the wind rustling the leaves of the great oak tree outside his window. It was a gentle, soothing sound. Despite the crushing weight of his lie, despite the constant, thrumming fear of discovery, he realized something incredibly strange. He felt more humanity, more genuine connection, behind this false mask in a foreign land than he ever had wearing his true uniform in the country of his birth. He was a liar. He was a fugitive. But as he drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the quiet, sleeping enemy who had become his only friends, he hoped that maybe, just maybe, the goodness he was pretending to have might one day become real. A single drop of tea against fine porcelain can sound as loud as a falling bomb when your hands refuse to stop shaking. It was a late Tuesday afternoon when the invitation had come, delivered not with the sharp, terrifying knock of an officer, but with a soft, hesitant clearing of the throat. He had been standing in the small village post office, breathing in the smell of old paper and ink, when the postmistress, a widow with silver hair and kind, endlessly tired eyes, leaned across the wooden counter. She had looked at his worn coat, at the solitary shadow he always seemed to cast, and she had asked, in a voice as soft as falling leaves, "Will you come for tea?" To anyone else in the village, it was the simplest, most ordinary gesture of neighborly warmth. But to him, standing there with his forged identity papers burning a hole in his pocket, it felt like a summons to the most terrifying battlefield he had ever faced. He had survived the freezing sea. He had survived the flight through the dark. But how does a man who has spent his life wearing the uniform of a dark, sweeping terror survive the gentle, devastating kindness of an English parlor? He accepted, because to refuse would have drawn the very attention he so desperately needed to avoid. And so, as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the rolling green hills, casting long, golden shadows across the damp cobblestones, he found himself walking slowly toward her small stone cottage. Every step required a conscious, agonizing effort of will. He was walking toward the hearth of the enemy. He rehearsed his English in his mind, rolling the vowels over his tongue, terrified that a single, sharp consonant from his native language would slip out and shatter the fragile illusion of his existence. He reminded himself of his fake name. He reminded himself of the fabricated story he had built, a quiet history of a quiet man displaced by the storms of the continent. But the mask felt terribly thin today. He lifted his hand and knocked gently on the heavy oak door. It opened almost immediately, accompanied by the warm, rich smell of wood smoke, baking apples, and lavender. The widow welcomed him in, taking his damp hat and coat with hands that were rough from years of silent, enduring work. She guided him into the small sitting room. It was a masterpiece of cozy, fragile domesticity. The walls were lined with books, a small, cheerful fire crackled in the hearth, throwing dancing orange light across a faded floral rug. In the corner, a tall grandfather clock ticked with a slow, heavy rhythm, a heartbeat of perfect peace. He sat down on the edge of a velvet armchair, keeping his knees close together, his hands resting stiffly on his thighs. He felt impossibly large, impossibly sharp, in this room made of soft edges and quiet memories. He was a creature of the dark, invited into the light, and he was terrified that his mere presence would somehow stain the upholstery. She brought in a silver tray carrying a delicately painted porcelain teapot, 2 fragile cups, and a small plate of shortbread biscuits. It was a feast in these times of heavy rationing, a quiet, profound sacrifice offered to a total stranger. She poured the tea. The golden liquid cascaded into the cup, a thin wisp of steam curling into the cool air of the parlor. She handed it to him. He reached out, and to his absolute horror, his hand began to tremble. It was not a small quiver. It was a deep, uncontrollable shaking, born of days of suppressed terror, of the crushing weight of his lie, and of the overwhelming, confusing warmth of this woman's hospitality. He gripped the tiny, delicate handle, terrified he would drop it, terrified the china would shatter against the floorboards just as his soul had shattered weeks ago. He brought his other hand up, wrapping both palms around the warm, curved porcelain to steady it. The cup clinked softly against the saucer. The sound echoed in his ears. He looked down, deeply ashamed, waiting for her to notice, waiting for her to ask the question that would unravel his life. But she didn't ask. She simply looked at him, her eyes softening with a deep, maternal understanding. She saw a man trembling. She didn't know what ghosts he was running from, but she knew what ghosts looked like. She had her own. With a slow, graceful movement, she reached out and gently placed her hand over his. Her skin was warm and paper-thin. "It is a cold wind today," she murmured, her voice a soothing balm. "Drink your tea, my dear. It will warm your bones." He nodded, unable to speak, the tightness in his throat entirely preventing any words from forming. He lifted the cup to his lips and took a sip. It tasted of earth and warmth and a peace he had never known. As he lowered the cup, his eyes drifted to the mantelpiece above the crackling fire. Sitting there, in a polished silver frame, was a photograph. It was a young man, barely out of his boyhood, wearing the sharp, unmistakable uniform of the British Royal Air Force. He had his mother's kind eyes, and a wide, confident smile. The air in the fugitive's lungs turned to ice. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to stop. This woman, who had just poured him her precious rationed tea, who had just placed her warm hand over his trembling fingers to offer him comfort, had lost her son to the very war he had helped to orchestrate. He had stood in the sweeping halls of the Black Order, surrounded by the men who had planned the skies this boy had fallen from. He was drinking tea in the home of a mother he had helped to break. The guilt was a physical crushing weight. It pressed down on his chest, a dark, heavy stone of profound sorrow. He wanted to throw himself at her feet. He wanted to weep, to beg for a forgiveness he knew he could never, ever deserve. He was a monster, sitting in the sanctuary of an angel. This beautiful, quiet parlor, with its lace doilies and ticking clock, stood in such heartbreaking contrast to the violent, roaring reality of the world outside its walls. The regime he had fled was built on the complete erasure of humanity, on a brutal, mechanized cruelty that is almost impossible to comprehend when sitting by a warm fire. The true, unfiltered face of the war was often kept hidden from parlors like this, sanitized for the public, considered too raw and deeply unsettling for polite society. But to truly grasp the absolute miracle of this woman's kindness, one must sometimes look directly at the horrors that surrounded it. For those of you who wish to understand history exactly as it was, without the gentle filters of time, I have curated a collection of unseen, raw, and completely uncensored images and videos from the war. Because of their intense, unvarnished nature, they cannot be shared on regular platforms, so I have placed them on a private Gumroad page. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is a sobering journey, but one that makes moments of quiet grace shine all the brighter. He stared at the photograph on the mantelpiece, the steam from his tea blurring his vision. The widow followed his gaze. She did not cry. Her grief was an old, familiar friend by now, a quiet companion that sat with her in the evenings. "He was my only one," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the crackle of the fire. "He went into the sky, and he didn't come back down." She looked back at the fugitive. She saw the tears standing in his eyes, tracking slowly down his pale, drawn cheeks. She thought he was weeping in sympathy for her loss. She thought he was mourning a boy he had never met. "You have lost people too, haven't you?" she asked gently. He closed his eyes. He thought of his mother, whom he would never see again. He thought of the man he used to be, the boy who had died the moment he put on that dark uniform. He thought of the millions of souls vanishing in the shadows of the continent. "Yes," he whispered, his voice cracking, the English word feeling like a heavy stone falling from his lips. "I have lost everything." "Then we will drink our tea," she said, her voice carrying the quiet, unbreakable resilience of a generation that had learned to survive simply by carrying on. "We will drink our tea, and we will keep the fire warm." They sat in silence for a long time. It was not an awkward silence, but a profound, shared space of mourning. They were two human beings, entirely separated by borders, by ideologies, by the massive, sweeping forces of history, yet brought together in a tiny room by the simple, ancient ritual of sharing a warm drink. He slowly finished his tea. His hands had stopped trembling. The warmth of the fire had seeped into his shins, and the gentle, steady ticking of the clock had become a rhythm of survival. He realized, sitting there, that this widow, with her soft voice and her chipped porcelain cups, was fighting a war of her own. Her resistance was not made of bullets or grand speeches. Her resistance was her absolute refusal to let the darkness turn her cold. She was fighting hatred with hospitality. She was fighting despair with a plate of shortbread biscuits. When the teapot was empty, he stood up. He felt exhausted, but it was a different kind of exhaustion. It was not the frantic, draining terror of the escape. It was the deep, weary peace of a soul that has finally been allowed to set down its armor, if only for an hour. She fetched his coat from the hall. As he slipped it on, he turned to face her. He wanted to say something profound. He wanted to find the English words to explain the absolute miracle of what she had just done for him. But all he could manage was a low, sincere whisper. "Thank you." She smiled, a genuine, beautiful expression that lit up the tired corners of her eyes. "You are welcome here any time, my friend. Mind the step on your way out." He stepped back out into the twilight. The village was wrapped in the dark, heavy blanket of the blackout, but the sky above was clear, dusted with a million cold, brilliant stars. He walked slowly back up the cobblestone lane toward his small room under the eaves. The cool evening air brushed against his face, drying the faint tracks of tears on his cheeks. He was still a fugitive. He was still a man harboring a terrible, dangerous secret. He was still living in the heart of the enemy. But as he pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, he realized that something fundamental had shifted inside him. He had walked into that cottage as a ghost, terrified of the light. He was walking out as a man who had been seen, who had been cared for, and who had been forgiven by someone who didn't even know his crimes. He carried the memory of that porcelain cup in his hands like a fragile, glowing ember. The trepidation had not vanished. He knew he would always carry the fear of discovery, but it had been profoundly softened by grace. He belonged to this quiet village now, bound to it not by duty or blood, but by the quiet, unbreakable thread of an offered cup of tea. Sound travels farther in the dark, especially when it carries the weight of a breaking world. In the quiet parlor of the boarding house, the evenings were measured by the soft, amber glow of the wireless radio. It sat in the corner of the room like a small, wooden shrine, its vacuum tubes humming with a gentle, comforting warmth. Every night, exactly at the hour when the shadows outside grew long enough to swallow the cobblestone lanes, the landlady would carefully turn the heavy bakelite dial. The radio would offer a soft crackle, a breath of static that sounded like the distant sea, before the calm, impossibly steady voice of the BBC announcer filled the room. He would sit in the worn velvet armchair near the hearth, an open book resting on his lap. To anyone looking, he was simply a quiet man, deeply engrossed in a novel, sharing the comforting routine of an English evening. But his eyes never moved across the page. Every fiber of his being was tuned to that small wooden box. He was listening to the echoes of the world he had abandoned. The announcer spoke of sweeping movements, of distant fronts, of cities he knew intimately, cities where he had once walked, where he had bought newspapers, where he had watched the autumn leaves fall. Now, those same names were spoken in the context of falling bombs, of shattering glass, and of skies painted red with fire. The juxtaposition was almost too much for the human heart to hold. Here, in this sleepy village, the only sounds were the rhythmic click-clack of the landladies knitting needles and the gentle settling of burning logs in the fireplace. There was a profound, enduring peace within these stone walls. Yet, drifting through the woven fabric of the radio speaker was the undeniable proof that just across the narrow stretch of the channel, the continent was tearing itself apart. He listened to the casualty reports, the soft, sterile numbers that masked an ocean of human grief. With every word, a terrible, complicated guilt twisted in his chest. He was safe. He was sitting in a warm room, his stomach full of simple, nourishing food, enveloped in the quiet kindness of strangers. But his homeland was burning. The people he had grown up with, the innocent families who had no part in the dark machinery of the regime, were suffering under the blackened skies. He felt the sudden, agonizing urge to reach through the radio, to stretch his hands across the cold water of the channel, and pull them all into this quiet parlor. He wanted to offer them the warmth of the hearth. He wanted to tell them that there were places in the world where the sky was still quiet, where a man could simply walk down a lane without looking over his shoulder. But he was a ghost. He could do nothing but listen to the static, a silent witness to a tragedy he had once been a tiny, terrifying part of. As the broadcast shifted to news of the inner workings of the continent, a different kind of chill settled over his skin. The announcer spoke of the regime's movements, of the tightening grip of the secret police, of the relentless pursuit of anyone deemed a traitor to the cause. The knitting needles in the landlady's hands paused for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement of the darkness, before resuming their steady rhythm. But in the velvet chair, the fugitive forgot how to breathe. He knew those men. He knew the exact, echoing hallways where those orders were being drafted. He knew the smell of the ink, the harsh artificial light of the offices, the cold, empty eyes of the commanders who viewed human life as nothing more than arithmetic on a ledger. And with a crushing, absolute certainty, he knew that they had realized he was gone. His empty desk. His missing papers. The forged transit passes he had slipped away with. The Black Order did not suffer fractures, and they certainly did not forgive desertion. They would be hunting him. It wouldn't be a loud, public chase. It would be a quiet, methodical erasure. They would whisper his name into telephones, they would dispatch men in plain clothes to border towns, they would search the ledgers of every departing vessel. He imagined them standing in his small, abandoned quarters back in the fatherland. He pictured a gloved hand opening his empty drawers, looking for a clue, a mistake, a lingering scent of his treason. The sheer terror of it made the warm tea in his stomach feel like ice. Even here, hundreds of miles away, wrapped in the safety of an English village, the shadow of his former masters felt close enough to touch. He could almost feel their breath on the back of his neck, a phantom presence haunting his every waking moment. Sitting in that dim parlor, listening to the crackling static of the wireless, he was desperately searching for the truth hidden between the lines of the broadcasts, seeking a connection to the reality he had left behind. Finding those genuine connections to the past is something that draws so many of us to history. Today, we don't have to rely on muffled radio signals to understand the profound human experiences of those who lived through the shadows of the war. If you find yourself wanting to look deeper, to explore the raw and unvarnished realities that shaped our world, I have created a quiet space for us on Patreon. There, we share free podcasts, raw, unblurred sections of history, and gather together as a warm community of history lovers who appreciate these quiet, human truths. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is a peaceful place to listen to the echoes of the past together, and I would be so honored to welcome you there. When the news finally ended, replaced by the soft, mournful strains of a classical symphony, the landlady sighed, a long, weary sound. She reached over and clicked the radio off. The amber light faded, and the room was plunged back into the quiet, ticking silence of the English night. Terrible things in the dark, she murmured, gathering her yarn. She didn't expect an answer, and he didn't offer one. She wished him a gentle good night and climbed the wooden stairs. He remained in the velvet chair long after the embers in the fireplace had burned down to a soft, glowing red. The silence of the parlor was heavy, pressing against his eardrums. He closed his book, the pages still unread, and rested his head against the high back of the chair. The fear of discovery wrestled endlessly with the guilt of his survival. He wondered about his family. The regime was famous for its cruelty not just to those who fled, but to those they left behind. Had men in dark leather coats knocked on his mother's door? Had they stood in her quiet kitchen, asking questions she could not answer, punishing her for a son who had vanished into the mist? The thought was a physical torment. It was a poison that seeped into his veins, making his hands tremble in the dark. He wanted to write to her. He wanted to scream across the channel that he was sorry, that he had to leave to save his own soul, that he loved her more than the world itself. But to send a letter would be to sign her death warrant, and his own. He was completely, irrevocably marooned on this island of safety. He finally rose from the chair, the floorboards groaning softly beneath his weight. He walked up the stairs to his room under the eaves. The window was dark, weeping with a fresh sheet of rain. He stood before it, looking out toward the south, toward the invisible water of the channel and the burning continent beyond. He placed his hand flat against the cold glass. He closed his eyes and imagined he could feel the vibrations of the distant thunder, the terrible, mechanized roar of a world losing its mind. But there was only the gentle patter of the English rain, washing the slate roof, indifferent to the suffering of men. He survived the night by building small fortresses in his mind. He focused on the memory of the baker's warm smile. He thought of the old man with the wheelbarrow. He clung to the fragile, beautiful reality of the village that slept peacefully around him. He told himself that the shadows could not cross the water. He told himself that the uniform he had left behind was buried deep in the earth, and that the ghost of the Black Order could not find him in a room that smelled of lavender and old wood. He undressed in the dark, sliding beneath the rough woolen blankets of his narrow iron bed. The radio was silent downstairs, but the echoes continued to bounce around the walls of his skull. He lay there, suspended between the life he had escaped and the lie he was living, listening to the rain, and waiting for the mercy of sleep to carry him away from the channel, if only until the morning. A single envelope, light as a feather, can hold enough gravity to pull a man's entire world apart. The morning began with the kind of delicate, muted beauty that only an English autumn can offer. A thick, silvery mist had rolled down from the hills during the night, settling softly over the rooftops and wrapping the village in a cool, damp embrace. The world was quiet, muffled, and slow to wake. From his small window under the eaves, he watched the village slowly come to life. The chimneys began to breathe their thin, gray plumes of peat smoke into the chilled air, and the distant, rhythmic thud of an axe splitting firewood echoed from a nearby farm. It was a day that felt impossibly safe. Over the past few weeks, he had carefully, meticulously woven himself into the quiet tapestry of this place. He had learned the exact, polite distance to stand from the baker's counter. He had learned to nod with the right amount of weary solidarity when the locals spoke of the rationing. He had built a fortress of absolute, unremarkable normalcy. After a simple breakfast of toasted bread and a cup of weak, rationed tea, he stepped outside. The air smelled of wet soil and decaying leaves, a rich, earthy scent that grounded him. He took a worn wooden broom from the side of the boarding house and began to sweep the small, stone-paved path leading to the front gate. It was a mundane task, a gentle, repetitive motion that quieted the endless, racing thoughts in his mind. The scratch of the stiff bristles against the stone was a soothing rhythm, a metronome for a life that was finally, blessedly still. But in a world consumed by a great and terrible war, stillness is only ever an illusion. Down the winding cobblestone lane, a sound emerged from the mist. It was a familiar sound, one that happened every single morning just after the church clock chimed 9. It was the soft, rhythmic squeak of a bicycle chain, accompanied by the slow crunch of rubber tires against the damp gravel. It was the village postman. In times of peace, a postman is simply a man carrying paper. But in times of war, the postman becomes an entirely different kind of figure. He is the harbinger of fate. He carries letters from the front lines, folded pieces of paper that smell of dust and distance, bringing the miraculous news that a son, a husband, or a brother is still breathing. And, tragically, he also carries the small, devastating telegrams, the yellow envelopes that can instantly turn a home of quiet hope into a house of absolute, unbreakable mourning. The village always held its breath when the postman rode down the lane. Women would pause in their gardens, their hands stilling in the soil. Older men would look up from their newspapers, watching the red bicycle glide past the stone walls. The fugitive continued to sweep, his head bowed, his movements steady and practiced. He had no reason to fear the postman. There was no one in this world who knew his new name, and there was no one left who could safely write to his old one. To the postal service, he did not exist. He was a phantom, and phantoms do not receive mail. He listened to the bicycle draw closer. The squeak of the pedal. The rustle of the heavy leather satchel slung across the postman's shoulder. Usually, the older man would simply ring his small silver bell, offer a polite tip of his woolen cap, and roll smoothly past the boarding house gate. But today, the squeaking stopped. The heavy, rubber-soled boot of the postman dragged against the cobblestones, bringing the bicycle to a slow, deliberate halt right in front of the low stone wall. The fugitive froze. The broom suspended halfway through a sweep. He didn't look up immediately. He couldn't. His eyes were fixed on the wet, brown autumn leaves gathered near the tip of his broom. In the span of a single heartbeat, the quiet, safe cocoon of the misty morning violently shattered. Slowly, agonizingly, he lifted his gaze. The postman, a man with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen the trenches of the First Great War, was looking directly at him. It wasn't a passing glance. It wasn't a polite, neighborly nod. It was a deep, lingering, searching look. The older man's brow was slightly furrowed, his hands resting on the handlebars, his eyes sweeping over the fugitive's worn coat, his tense shoulders, his pale face. Time entirely stopped. The silence in the lane became deafening. The gentle ticking of the fugitive's watch, strapped to his wrist, sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. A sudden, blinding wave of sheer, absolute terror crashed over him. It started in his chest, a cold, hard knot that instantly radiated out to his fingertips, leaving his hands numb and trembling. They know. The thought screamed through his mind with the force of a derailing train. They know who I am. They found the forged stamps on my papers. The accent slipped. Someone noticed the way I lace my boots. British intelligence is waiting at the end of the lane. The local constable is coming. It is over. He felt the physical urge to run, a primal, deeply ingrained instinct to drop the broom, leap the low stone wall, and disappear into the thick woods behind the village. He imagined the shouting, the barking of dogs, the heavy hands grabbing his arms, pinning him to the wet earth. He imagined the dark, windowless cell where they would interrogate him, stripping away his fake name, exposing the monster he had once been. He imagined the absolute disgust on the faces of the villagers when they realized they had been sharing their bread with a man from the Black Order. The postman reached a weathered hand into his heavy leather satchel. The fugitive stopped breathing. His knees locked. He braced himself for whatever was about to happen. Perhaps it wasn't a letter. Perhaps it was a summons. Perhaps it was the local authorities, using the postman as a gentle, unassuming guise to confirm his identity before the trap was sprung. The older man pulled out a small, pale blue envelope. He looked at the handwriting on the front, then looked back up at the terrified man standing behind the gate. "Pardon me, friend," the postman said. His voice was rough, carrying the gravelly warmth of a man who had smoked a pipe for 40 years. "You're boarding at Mrs. Gable's, aren't you?" The fugitive's throat was so dry it felt like it was filled with dust. He forced himself to swallow. He forced his head to nod. "Yes," he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible over the rustle of the wind in the oak trees. "Thought so," the postman said, offering a small, apologetic smile. "I've got a letter here for a Mr. Thomas Higgins. He lodged in your room before the war took him to the Navy. It looks like it's been chasing him across 3 different ports, finally got sent back here. Would you mind terribly passing it to the landlady for me? Save my old knees the walk up the path." The words hung in the misty air. A letter. For the previous tenant. Save his old knees. The realization hit the fugitive with such staggering force that he actually swayed on his feet. He had to grip the wooden handle of the broom with white-knuckled intensity just to keep himself from collapsing onto the wet stones. It wasn't intelligence. It wasn't the police. It wasn't discovery. It was just a favor. A simple, beautifully mundane, incredibly ordinary favor. Of course, the fugitive breathed out, the English words trembling on his lips. I will give it to her. He stepped forward, his legs feeling like they were moving through deep water. He reached over the stone wall and gently took the pale blue envelope from the postman's hand. Much obliged, the postman said cheerfully, tapping the brim of his cap. He pushed his foot against the pedal, the chain squeaked its familiar rhythm, and the red bicycle slowly disappeared into the gray mist down the lane. The fugitive stood alone at the gate, clutching the small paper envelope to his chest. His heart was beating so fast and so hard that it physically ached. He closed his eyes, resting his forehead against the cold, damp wood of the gatepost, and let out a long, shuddering breath. He had survived. The mask had not slipped. The secret was still safe. But as the adrenaline slowly began to recede, leaving him feeling hollowed out and profoundly exhausted, a deep, sorrowful realization settled over him. The village was a sanctuary, yes. The people were kind, the lanes were quiet, and the war felt very far away. But his mind was not a sanctuary. His mind was still a battlefield, heavily guarded, laced with tripwires, and perpetually braced for an attack. The paranoia was a ghost that lived inside his own skin. He could cross the ocean, he could change his name, he could burn his uniform, but he could not outrun the sheer terror of what he had been a part of. A single, lingering glance from an old man on a bicycle was enough to completely dismantle him. He realized then that freedom is not just a place on a map. Freedom is a state of mind, and his mind was still a prisoner of the Black Order. He looked down at the pale blue envelope in his trembling hands. It was fragile, worn at the edges from its long journey. He wondered who had written it. A mother? A sweetheart? He felt a profound sense of reverence for this small object. It was a tangible piece of someone's life, a physical bridge of ink and paper trying to cross the vast, violent chasm of the war. These physical objects, the letters, the photographs, the worn pieces of uniform, they carry the true, heavy weight of history. They anchor us to the human hearts that beat so frantically during those dark years. Holding onto these tangible connections helps us remember the reality of what people endured. If you feel a deep connection to the past and wish to hold a piece of that history in your own hands, or if you simply want to immerse yourself in the visual reality of the era, I highly recommend exploring the authentic WWII memorabilia available on Amazon or watching beautifully grounded films like Midway on Prime. It is a powerful way to honor the quiet resilience of those who lived through it. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. He held the letter carefully, as if it were made of spun glass. He turned around, leaving the broom leaning against the stone wall, and walked slowly back up the path to the boarding house. The hallway was quiet, smelling of floor wax and the landlady's lavender polish. He found her in the kitchen, kneading a small bowl of dough. He placed the blue envelope gently on the wooden table. "The postman asked me to give this to you," he said softly. "For Mr. Higgins." The landlady stopped kneading, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. She looked at the letter, a small, sad smile touching the corners of her mouth. "Ah, Tommy," she sighed. "Bless him. I'll make sure it finds its way back to his family in the next village. Thank you, my dear." She went back to her dough, the matter entirely settled, completely unaware of the absolute hurricane of terror that small blue envelope had just caused. He walked slowly up the creaking stairs to his room under the eaves. He closed the door, turning the iron key in the lock, and sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. His hands were still cold. He looked out the small window. The mist was beginning to lift, revealing the rolling green hills bathed in a soft, pale sunlight. It was a beautiful, peaceful morning. But he knew now, with absolute certainty, that he would never truly be at peace. Every time a door knocked unexpectedly, every time a stranger asked for the time, every time a shadow fell too heavily across his path, the terror would return. He would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for the heavy hand of his past to finally catch up to him. But as he sat there, listening to the quiet, steady rhythm of the English village carrying on around him, he made a silent, deeply private vow. He would endure the fear. He would carry the paranoia, however heavy it became. Because feeling terrified in the light was infinitely better than being perfectly safe in the dark. He took a deep breath, smoothing his hands over the fabric of his worn civilian trousers. He stood up, walked to the washstand, and splashed cold water onto his pale face. He looked at his reflection in the cracked mirror, forcing the fear out of his eyes, carefully rebuilding the quiet, unremarkable mask of the gentle stranger. There was a whole day ahead of him. The baker needed a polite smile. The postmistress needed a quiet nod. He would go back downstairs, he would walk out into the village, and he would perform the everyday heroism of simply carrying on, an invisible fugitive hiding in plain sight, entirely alone, but incredibly, miraculously alive. The heaviest doors are the ones we build inside our own minds. When the sun finally surrendered to the horizon, and the sleepy English village pulled the thick, dark blanket of the blackout over its rooftops, the man in the attic room was left entirely alone with the silence. During the day, the mask of the gentle, quiet stranger protected him. The cobblestones, the friendly baker, the old man with the wheelbarrow, they all demanded his attention, forcing him to stay anchored in the present moment. But when the day was done, when the last embers in the parlor hearth faded to a soft, glowing ash and the landlady climbed the stairs to her own bed, the performance had to end. Up in the narrow room beneath the eaves, there was no one left to perform for. He would carefully take off his worn civilian coat, folding it over the back of the solitary wooden chair. He would unlace his boots with slow, deliberate fingers, placing them neatly by the door. And as the physical garments of his new life were shed, the fragile walls of his defense began to crumble. The dark is a canvas, and a guilty mind is a restless painter. He would lie on his back on the thin mattress, pulling the scratchy woolen blanket up to his chest, and close his eyes. He wanted, more than anything in the world, to simply drift into a quiet, dreamless sleep. But the moment his breathing slowed, the ghosts would step out from the shadows of the sloping ceiling. They were not the transparent, wailing phantoms of old village stories. The ghosts that haunted this attic were far more terrifying because they were woven from absolute reality. They were made of memory. He would hear the sharp, rhythmic click of his own polished boots echoing down the impossibly long, cold hallways of the Black Order. He would feel the stiff, suffocating collar of his uniform pressing against his throat. And then, the faces would appear. They drifted into his mind's eye with a sorrowful, devastating clarity. The clerk who had looked up at him with terrified, trembling eyes as he handed over a stack of deportation files. The mother he had seen standing on a snowy train platform, clutching a small woven suitcase, her face a portrait of quiet, dignified despair. He had not loaded the trains. He had not stood in the freezing mud of the camps. He had been a man of paper, a quiet architect in a warm room. But lying in the English dark, he understood the profound, inescapable truth of his complicity. Every signature, every filed document, every time he had looked down at his polished desk instead of meeting the eyes of the condemned, he had added a brick to the terrible machine. The guilt was a living, breathing weight pressing down on his ribcage. He would twist in the narrow bed, the sheets tangling around his legs, his forehead damp with a cold, desperate sweat. He would try to force the memories away, trying to replace them with the image of the English rolling hills, or the smell of the village bakery, but the dark was too strong. The ink on the papers in his mind was still wet, and the stain of it felt like it was seeping right through his skin. Sometimes, the weight would become so unbearable that he would have to throw the blanket aside and stand up. He would pace the few short steps across the uneven floorboards, the old wood groaning softly under his bare feet. He would walk to the small porcelain washstand in the corner of the room. The pitcher was filled with water that was bitterly cold, drawn from the village well just that morning. He would pour a slow, clear stream into the basin. The sound of the water was a gentle, grounding anchor in the swirling tempest of his mind. He would take the small, rough block of lye soap the landlady had provided and begin to wash his hands. He washed them with a slow, agonizing thoroughness. He lathered the rough soap between his palms, scrubbing the knuckles, tracing the lines of his palms, working the suds under his fingernails. He would rinse them in the freezing water, the cold biting into his skin, and then he would reach for the soap and begin all over again. It was a quiet, desperate ritual. He was a man trying to wash the psychological blood from his hands, trying to scrub away an ideology that had stained his very soul. He would stand there in the dark for what felt like hours, the only sound in the room the soft, rhythmic splashing of the water and the ragged, uneven pull of his own breathing. He knew, logically, that water and soap could not cleanse a conscience. But the physical sensation of the cold, the friction of the soap, the absolute focus on the tiny, ordinary task, slowly began to pull him back from the edge of the abyss. History so often focuses on the grand, sweeping movements of armies, the signing of treaties, and the roar of the front lines. But the true, heavy weight of the war was so frequently carried in absolute secrecy, hidden away in dimly lit attics, in letters that were never sent, and in the quiet, solitary battles fought by ordinary human hearts in the dead of night. If you find yourself drawn to these hidden narratives, the unseen corners of the past where the most profound struggles took place, I would love to invite you to join my free email newsletter. When you sign up, I will send you a free copy of my ebook, The Shadow War: 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. Every week, we take a gentle, deep dive into stories of espionage, quiet resilience, and the forgotten secrets that changed the shape of the world. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is a quiet, thoughtful community of history lovers, and I would be so deeply honored to share these forgotten whispers of the past with you. When his hands were scrubbed raw and aching from the cold, he would finally dry them on a thin cotton towel. He would walk to the small dormer window, leaning his forehead against the chilled glass. Outside, the world was bathed in the pale, ethereal light of a half-moon. The rolling hills of the English countryside looked like a vast, sleeping ocean of silver and shadow. The oak trees stood like silent sentinels, their bare branches reaching up toward the cold stars. It was a landscape of absolute, enduring peace. It cared nothing for borders, or uniforms, or the terrifying things men did to one another in the name of power. As he looked out at the silver hills, he noticed a tiny movement on the windowsill. A small, pale moth was fluttering gently against the glass, its delicate, dusty wings tapping a fragile, erratic rhythm. It was a tiny creature, completely unaware of the war raging across the channel, entirely unburdened by the past or the future. It was just looking for the light. He watched the moth for a long time. There was something profoundly comforting in its simple, uncomplicated existence. It reminded him that despite the horrors he had witnessed, despite the crushing weight of the ghosts in his attic, the world was still full of fragile, beautiful things that simply carried on. He turned away from the window and walked back to the small wooden chair. Draped across the back, beneath his worn civilian coat, was a hand-knitted woolen blanket. The landlady had left it at the foot of his bed a few days prior, without a word of explanation, simply a quiet gesture of warmth against the creeping autumn chill. The wool was a soft, mottled gray, smelling faintly of lavender and wood smoke. He picked it up and wrapped it around his shivering shoulders. The warmth of the wool felt like an embrace. It was a tangible, physical proof of human kindness, a counterweight to the cruelty that haunted his memories. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed, pulling the blanket tightly around himself, and closed his eyes. He realized then that the ghosts would never truly leave him. They were a permanent part of his architecture now, the tragic inheritance of the uniform he had worn. He could not erase them, and perhaps he shouldn't try. To forget them would be a final, unforgivable insult to the faces that drifted through his mind. But he also realized that he did not have to let them consume him. He could sit with them in the dark, acknowledge their presence, and mourn the things that could not be changed. He could carry the sorrow, but he could also wrap himself in the gifted warmth of a stranger's blanket. He lay back down on the pillow. The attic was still quiet, the floorboards still creaked slightly as the old house settled into the night, but the air felt a little less suffocating. The cold water had grounded him, the silver moonlight had calmed him, the soft wool had comforted him. He focused his mind on the small, gentle details of his new life. The way the baker dusted the counter with flour. The sound of the postman's bicycle chain. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the parlor downstairs. He built a quiet, safe room in his mind, brick by tiny brick, and invited the exhausted, frightened parts of his soul to step inside and rest. Slowly, imperceptibly, the deep, bruised purple of the night sky began to soften. The edges of the shadows in the attic began to blur, turning from black to a soft, charcoal gray. The ghosts were retreating, folding themselves back into the corners, waiting for the night to return. But for now, the dawn was coming. And with the dawn came the mask, the cobblestones, and the beautiful, ordinary miracle of another day survived. He let out a long, slow breath, his chest finally relaxing its tight, anxious grip. And as the very first note of a waking songbird drifted through the misty morning air, the man in the attic finally, mercifully, drifted into a quiet sleep. True warmth is not found in the absence of the cold, but in the quiet, fragile spaces we carve out from the dark. By the time deep winter finally settled over the English countryside, the village had completely transformed. The rolling green hills, once so soft and forgiving, were locked beneath a hard, glittering layer of frost. The narrow, winding lanes became treacherous rivers of gray ice, and the ancient oak trees stood stark and bare, their dark branches scratching at a heavy, colorless sky. The wind that blew down from the northern moors was no longer a gentle breeze, it was a physical thing, a biting, relentless force that rattled the window panes and sawed out every crack in the old stone cottages. It was a season that forced the world to shrink, pushing everyone indoors, closer together, seeking refuge from the bitter chill. For the man living in the small room under the eaves, the cold was both a blessing and a curse. It kept the strangers away. It kept the roads quiet. But it also amplified the profound, aching isolation of his lie. The physical chill creeping under his door was nothing compared to the freezing dread that still lived in the hollow of his chest. But a village, at its heart, is a mechanism of survival. And in the dead of winter, the true center of that survival was not the church, nor the market, but the hearth of the local public house. It was a low, timber-framed building that seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. The windows were small, leaded glass panes that glowed with a thick, amber light, a beacon in the freezing fog. Every evening, as the blackout curtains were drawn tight against the world, the heavy wooden door would open and close, admitting a rush of freezing air and the hurried, bundled figures of the villagers. He had started going there not out of a desire for company, but simply to escape the bone-deep chill of his unheated attic. He would take a small table in the darkest corner, nursing a single half-pint of dark, bitter ale, intending only to absorb the ambient heat of the massive stone fireplace before retreating back to his solitude. But isolation is a very difficult thing to maintain when you are surrounded by people who have decided, with quiet, stubborn grace, that you belong to them. It happened slowly, imperceptibly. A nod from the blacksmith across the room. A shared, sympathetic sigh with the baker as the wind howled down the chimney. And then, one particularly brutal evening, when the snow was falling so thick it erased the shapes of the houses outside, an older farmer with a deeply lined face and hands like cured leather pulled out the chair opposite him. The man didn't ask, he simply sat down, placing his own glass on the scarred wood of the table, and began to speak softly about the difficulty of keeping the sheep warm on the high pastures. The fugitive had frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs, terrified that the mask was about to be tested. But the farmer wasn't interrogating him. He was just talking. He was sharing the mundane, beautiful struggles of his life with the quiet stranger who sat in the corner. That single, simple act broke the dam. Over the next few weeks, his dark corner ceased to be a place of hiding and became a place of gathering. He found himself drawn into the glowing, golden orbit of the hearth. He would sit near the roaring fire, the heat baking into his damp woolen trousers, and he would listen. He listened to the postmistress talk about her garden sleeping beneath the snow. He listened to the quiet, dignified grief of the men who raised their glasses to the names of the boys who were not coming home. He learned the rhythm of their laughter, a deep, resonant sound that felt entirely untainted by the cruelty of the world across the channel. And as he sat there, bathed in the firelight, holding a glass of ale in his thawing hands, a terrifying, beautiful realization washed over him. He knew them. He knew that the blacksmith walked with a slight limp when the weather turned damp. He knew that the baker always saved a piece of crust for the stray dog that slept near the church. He knew the absolute, quiet heroism of these people, who were enduring the crushing weight of rationing, of fear, and of loss, and yet still found the strength to share their fire with a man they barely knew. He looked around the room, at the faces illuminated by the dancing orange flames. He saw the soft, tired eyes of the landlady wiping down the counter. He saw the gentle, weathered smiles of the farmers. He saw humanity in its purest, most resilient form. He felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of affection swell in his chest. It was a love so deep and so unexpected that it brought a sharp, stinging tear to his eye. He loved them. He loved this village. He loved the cobblestones, the misty mornings, and the smell of the wood smoke. If the war ended tomorrow, if the borders opened and the shadows vanished, he realized he would not want to go back. This quiet, sleepy valley at the edge of the world had become his sanctuary, and these people, his enemies by the decree of a dark regime, had become his family. But with that profound love came an equally profound, suffocating pain. Because he was lying to them. Every single day. When the old farmer clapped him on the shoulder and called him a good lad, the fugitive felt a knife twist in his gut. When the landlady slipped an extra potato onto his plate, thinking of the quiet, displaced man far from his home, he wanted to weep. With shame. They were offering their precious, limited warmth to a phantom. They were embracing a man who had stood in the very halls where their destruction was being meticulously planned. He was a parasite, feeding on their goodness. He felt that if he truly loved them, he should run away into the snow, taking his dark history far from their pristine hearth. He felt that his mere presence in the room was a stain on their innocence. Yet, looking at the fire, watching the embers pulse with a deep, mesmerizing red, he knew he could not leave. To leave would be to break the illusion, to cause them worry, to introduce fear into the one place he had found peace. The only way to protect them from the monster he used to be was to perfectly, flawlessly continue to be the friend they believed he was. The mask could never, ever come off. It was no longer a tool of survival, it was an act of desperate, absolute devotion. These quiet, hidden moments of humanity, where enemies become family around a shared fire, are the true heartbeat of history. It takes a massive amount of research and time to gently dust off these forgotten memories and craft them into the stories we share in the dark. If you find comfort in these quiet hours, and if you would like to support the dedication it takes to keep this history alive, I would be incredibly grateful if you considered leaving a small tip on my Ko-Fi page. It is a humble space, but it allows me to continue searching for the light in the shadows of the past. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Knowing there are kind souls listening to these whispers makes the long hours of research a true privilege. As the evening wore on, the wind outside began to howl with a renewed, vicious fury, throwing handfuls of icy snow against the thick glass of the pub windows. The storm was trying desperately to break in. Inside, the fire was stoked higher, the logs snapping and hissing, filling the room with the sweet, rich scent of burning applewood. An old man, his hands trembling slightly as he held his pipe, leaned across the scarred wooden table toward the fugitive. The pub had grown quiet, the conversations lulling into a comfortable, sleepy silence. "It's a cruel night out there, friend," the old man whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Makes a man glad to have four walls and a good fire." The fugitive nodded slowly, wrapping his hands tightly around his glass. "Yes," he murmured, his English soft and carefully measured. "It makes a man very glad. You have a look about you, sometimes," the old man continued gently, his cloudy eyes resting on the fugitive's face. "Like a man who's walked a long way in the dark. You don't have to talk about it. We don't ask questions here. But you should know, whatever storm you walked out of, you don't have to walk back into it. You have a seat by this fire as long as it burns." The words were so simple, so entirely devoid of suspicion or malice, that they completely disarmed him. The old man didn't care about his past. He didn't care about the origins of his quiet sorrow. He only cared that a fellow human being was cold, and that there was room by the hearth. The fugitive closed his eyes, bowing his head slightly. The heat of the fire flushed his cheeks, but the warmth spreading through his chest had nothing to do with the burning logs. It was the warmth of absolute, unearned grace. It was the feeling of a fractured soul being gently, slowly bandaged by the hands of strangers. "Thank you," he whispered, and the words carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. He sat there for a long time, watching the old man puff on his pipe, watching the landlady knit in the corner, watching the golden light dance across the wooden beams of the ceiling. He let the guilt slowly recede, pushing it down into the dark corners of his mind, locking the door on the black order and the uniform he had burned. For tonight, he would not be a traitor. For tonight, he would not be a fugitive. For tonight, he would simply be a man sitting by a fire, listening to the wind, surrounded by his friends. When the time finally came to leave, when the logs had burned down to a soft, glowing ash and the pub began to empty, he stepped out into the freezing night. The storm was still raging. The snow whipped across his face, stinging his cheeks, and the cold instantly bit through his thin coat. He leaned into the wind, pulling his collar up, and began the slow, treacherous walk back to his boarding house. The cobblestones were slick with ice, and the world was entirely consumed by the roaring, white chaos of the winter gale. It was a terrifying, unforgiving landscape. But as he walked, his boots crunching softly in the snow, he did not feel afraid. He did not feel the crushing, lonely terror that had accompanied his flight across the continent. He felt a quiet, profound strength anchoring his steps. He had walked out of the darkest room in the world, crossed a freezing, violent sea, and arrived in a land that should have been his end. Instead, he had found a hearth. He had found a place where the humanity he had thought was entirely lost still existed, tending to a fire in the dark. The wind shrieked through the bare branches of the oak trees, a sound like a tearing sky. But inside his chest, protected from the cold, the ember of the village hearth continued to burn brightly. He carried their smiles, their soft words, and their quiet resilience within him. He was a man made of secrets, holding onto a lie that could destroy him. But as he turned the key in the lock of the boarding house, shaking the snow from his shoulders and stepping into the quiet, dark hallway, he knew that the lie was worth it. He would carry the burden of his past forever, in complete silence, simply for the privilege of warming his hands at their fire. Even the safest harbor can feel like a trap when the tide suddenly turns. The public house had become his quiet sanctuary, a room of amber light and familiar shadows where the heavy burden of his lie was momentarily lightened by the warmth of the hearth. He knew the creak of every floorboard. He knew the exact, comforting rhythm of the landlady wiping the scarred wooden counter. He knew the low, gravelly hum of the local farmers discussing the rain. In this small, contained world, he was no longer a fugitive running from the darkest corners of the continent. He was just a quiet neighbor, sitting in his usual chair, nursing a half-pint of dark ale. But sanctuary is a fragile thing, built on the assumption that the outside world will simply stay outside. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of evening where the rain fell in a slow, relentless drizzle, turning the cobblestone lanes into slick, shining ribbons. The pub was pleasantly full, a hum of gentle conversation wrapping around the room like a thick woolen blanket. He was sitting in his corner, his hands wrapped around his glass, feeling a rare, delicate sense of peace. He was listening to the blacksmith laugh, a deep, rumbling sound that always made him smile behind his glass. Then, the heavy oak door swung open. A sudden gust of damp, freezing wind swept through the room, making the flames in the hearth dance frantically and the oil lamps flicker and hiss. The low hum of conversation faltered, just for a second, as every head turned toward the door. Standing on the threshold was a stranger. He was a tall man, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. He wore the heavy, wet greatcoat of a soldier on leave, the dark wool saturated with rain. He took off his peaked cap, revealing a face that was young, but deeply, terribly exhausted. His eyes were sharp, carrying the unmistakable, hardened look of a man who had seen the true, violent reality of the world beyond the village borders. He smelled of wet earth, strong tobacco, and the undeniable, metallic scent of the war. The fugitive felt the blood drain entirely from his face. His hands, previously warm and relaxed around his glass, instantly turned to ice. The stranger stepped inside, closing the door against the wind with a heavy thud. He walked slowly toward the bar, his boots leaving dark, wet footprints on the floorboards. The villagers nodded to him, offering quiet murmurs of respect to the uniform, recognizing him not as a local, but as one of the countless weary souls traveling the country's rail lines, passing through their quiet valley on his way to somewhere else. The landlady poured him a drink, her voice soft and motherly as she offered him a towel to dry his hair. The stranger accepted it with a tired smile, but his sharp eyes were already scanning the room. He was looking at the faces, assessing the room with the ingrained, hypervigilant instincts of a man trained to survive. And then, his gaze stopped. It landed squarely on the quiet man sitting in the shadows of the corner. The fugitive stopped breathing. He felt completely, agonizingly exposed. The mask he had so carefully constructed, the gentle English vowels he had practiced until his throat ached, the slow, unassuming posture, it all felt like tissue paper in the face of this soldier's calculating stare. This stranger did not know the village rules. He did not know that questions were not asked here. The stranger picked up his glass and slowly, deliberately, began to walk across the room. Every step the soldier took sounded like a deafening drumbeat in the fugitive's ears. He wanted to shrink into the wood of his chair. He wanted to melt into the shadows. He mentally scrambled for his forged papers, running through the fabricated story of his past, desperately checking the seams of his life for any tears. The stranger reached the table. He stood there for a long moment, looking down. The firelight caught the harsh angles of his face. "Mind if I sit?" the soldier asked. His voice was low, carrying a flat, unreadable accent from a city far away. The fugitive's throat was paralyzed. He forced himself to offer a small, tight nod, gesturing with a trembling hand to the empty wooden chair opposite him. The soldier sat down heavily, sighing as the warmth of the fire reached his damp uniform. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving the fugitive's face. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, drowning out the gentle murmur of the pub around them. "I don't recognize you," the stranger said finally. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, delivered with the quiet authority of a man who expects an answer. I am not from here," the fugitive managed to whisper. He focused all his desperate energy on keeping his accent soft, trying to bury the sharp consonants of his native tongue beneath the rolling cadence he had learned from the villagers. The stranger tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I can hear that. Where exactly are you from, friend?" The word friend hung in the air, laced with a subtle, probing suspicion. This was it. This was the moment the fragile glass house would shatter. If this soldier pushed too hard, if he asked the wrong question about geography, about a town the fugitive claimed to be from but knew nothing about, the entire illusion would collapse. He would be exposed, not just as a liar, but as a ghost of the Black Order, sitting right in the heart of their country. He took a slow, shallow breath, preparing to deliver the lie that his life depended on. It is in these breathtaking, quiet moments of pure terror that the true weight of the war can be felt most acutely. The soldier sitting at the table carried the raw, unfiltered reality of the front lines with him, a reality so harsh and brutal that it cannot be easily described with words alone. If you find yourself wanting to look past the sanitized versions of history, to truly see the unvarnished truth that shaped men like the stranger in the pub, I have something deeply powerful to share with you. I have curated a private collection on Gumroad featuring unseen, raw, and completely uncensored images and videos of the war. These are the restricted, unfiltered pieces of history that reveal the true cost of those dark years, providing a profound context for the stories we explore together. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Viewing this history directly is a solemn experience, but one that grounds us entirely in the reality of the past. The fugitive opened his mouth to speak, to spin the delicate thread of his false history, but before he could utter a single syllable, a shadow fell across the table. It was the blacksmith. The large, burly man had stepped away from the bar, a fresh pint in his massive hand. He stood right behind the stranger's chair, casting a protective, imposing silhouette over the small table. "He's a quiet one, our friend here," the blacksmith said. His voice was casual, easy, but there was an unmistakable, solid weight beneath the words. It was the tone of a man defending his own. "Come down from the north a while back. Keeps to himself. Men stings around the village." The stranger looked up, surprised by the interruption. He looked from the massive frame of the blacksmith back to the pale, trembling fugitive in the corner. Before the soldier could press further, the landlady's voice chimed in from across the room. She was wiping a glass with a white cloth, her eyes fixed firmly on the stranger. "And he's a good neighbor, Sergeant," she called out, her tone pleasant but carrying the absolute, unquestionable authority of a woman in her own domain. "Never causes a fuss. Pays his tab. Which is more than I can say for some of the lads who come through here." A low ripple of agreeable laughter moved through the locals in the pub. The tension in the room, which had been stretched as tight as a wire, suddenly softened. The stranger looked around. He saw the baker nodding. He saw the old farmer raising his glass in a silent toast to the quiet man in the corner. He saw a village that had seamlessly, instinctively closed ranks to protect one of their own. The soldier let out a long breath, the suspicion draining from his sharp eyes, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He was just a tired man looking for a spy in the shadows, but he had found a community instead. He nodded slowly, raising his hands in a small gesture of surrender. "No offense meant," the soldier said softly, turning back to the fugitive. "You can't be too careful these days. The world is full of ghosts." "None taken," the fugitive whispered, his voice shaking with a relief so profound it felt like a physical ache. The blacksmith clapped the soldier on the shoulder, a friendly, heavy thud. "Let me buy you a pint, Sergeant. You look like you've walked halfway across the world in the rain." The soldier allowed himself to be guided away from the table, back toward the warmth of the bar and the easy camaraderie of the locals. The immediate danger had passed. The storm had broken over him and moved on, leaving him untouched. But as he sat alone in the corner, staring down at his trembling hands, the fugitive realized he was crying. There were completely silent tears, slipping down his pale cheeks and dropping into his dark ale. He was weeping not from fear, but from a crushing, overwhelming sense of unworthiness. These people, the blacksmith, the landlady, the tired farmers, had just stood between him and the terrifying machinery of the state. They had vouched for him. They had laid their own reputations, their own safety, on the line to protect a man they barely knew, simply because he sat by their fire and caused no harm. They thought they were protecting a quiet, displaced soul from the North. They did not know they had just formed a human shield around an officer of the regime they were praying every night to defeat. They did not know that the hands they had just defended had once stamped papers that sent their own kind into the dark. He was a monster, hiding in a sanctuary built of pure, blind grace. He wanted to tear off his mask. He wanted to stand on the table and confess everything, to let the soldier arrest him, to face the punishment he so deeply deserved, so that he would no longer have to carry the agonizing weight of their undeserved love. But he looked at the landlady, smiling kindly at the tired soldier. He looked at the blacksmith, sharing a laugh by the hearth. If he confessed, he would break their hearts. He would shatter their trust in humanity. He would poison the very well of kindness that was keeping him alive. To protect them, he had to remain a lie. He reached up with a trembling hand and wiped the tears from his face. He took a long, slow breath, pulling the mask tightly back into place. The stranger at the bar glanced over his shoulder one last time, gave a small, respectful nod, and turned back to his drink. The fugitive nodded back. The performance resumed. The quiet resilience of his deception settled back into his bones. He would sit in his corner, he would drink his ale, and he would carry the immense, heartbreaking burden of knowing that his life had been saved by the absolute goodness of the very people he had once been taught to destroy. The heaviest words a man can write are the ones that will only ever be read by the fire. When the village finally surrendered to the deep, velvet quiet of the night, a different kind of life awoke in the small room under the eaves. Downstairs, the hearth was cold, the landlady was asleep, and the cobblestones outside were bathed in the pale, silent glow of the moon. But up in the attic, the fugitive would quietly push back his woolen blanket, his bare feet touching the chill of the wooden floorboards. He would walk to the small, battered desk sitting beneath the sloped roof, and with the utmost care, he would strike a single match. The small flame would flare, casting long, dancing shadows against the plaster walls, before settling into the steady, golden warmth of a solitary candle. In this small pool of light, he laid out his precious, hidden treasures. A small glass bottle of dark ink, a cheap wooden pen with a steel nib, and a few crisp, blank sheets of paper. During the day, he was a master of the mask. He smiled at the baker, he nodded to the postman, he mended fences and swept the path. He was a creature of the present, tied entirely to the gentle rhythms of the English countryside. But here, in the deeply isolated hours of the night, the mask was carefully set aside. Here, in the candlelight, he was allowed to be a son. He was allowed to be a brother. He was allowed to be a man mourning a life he could never return to. He would uncap the ink, the sharp, metallic smell of it filling the small space, a scent that immediately pulled him back across the freezing channel. He would dip the steel nib, watching the dark liquid cling to the metal, and then he would press it to the blank white page. "My dearest mother," he would write. The scratch of the pen in the silent room sounded remarkably loud, a desperate, frantic whisper against the quiet. He wrote to her in their native tongue, the language he was forbidden to speak in the light. The words flowed from his hand like water from a broken dam. He did not write about the war. He did not write about the terrifying ideology he had fled, or the cold, sweeping hallways of the Black Order. Instead, he wrote to her about the rain. He described the way the English mist settled over the rolling green hills in the morning, softening the edges of the world. He told her about the warm, crusty bread he bought from the village baker, and the quiet, unassuming kindness of the woman who baked it. He described his small room under the roof, the smell of lavender soap, and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the parlor downstairs. He wrote these things because he wanted, with a desperate, aching hunger, for her to know that he was safe. He imagined her sitting by her own window, hundreds of miles away in a country slowly tearing itself apart, staring out into the dark and wondering if her boy was lying frozen in some distant, muddy field. He wanted to reach through the paper, to smooth the worry lines from her forehead, and whisper that he was warm, that his stomach was full, and that he had found a place where the sky did not rain fire. He would pour his entire soul onto the page, his handwriting tight and hurried, terrified that the morning would come too soon and steal the moment away. He told her how much he missed the sound of her humming in the kitchen. He told her he remembered the smell of the pine trees behind their childhood home, and the way the snow looked when it first began to fall over their town. But as the page filled with his longing, a profound and devastating reality would settle over him. He could never send it. To fold this paper, to place it in an envelope, and to write her address upon it would be an act of absolute betrayal. If a letter bearing his handwriting, carrying an English postmark, ever reached her door, it would not bring her comfort. It would bring the men in the dark leather coats. It would bring the secret police. It would bring interrogations, terror, and a punishment far worse than the grief of believing him dead. His silence was the only shield he could offer her. His death, fabricated and complete, was the greatest act of love he had left to give. There is an unbearable, crushing weight to loving someone so deeply that you must pretend you no longer exist. It is a quiet agony that rarely finds its way into the grand, sweeping narratives of the past. So much of history is focused on the loud, visible clashes, but the true emotional core of the war is found right here, in the dimly lit rooms where ordinary human beings wrestled with impossible choices. Preserving these deeply intimate, hidden realities is why I am so devoted to exploring the unseen layers of our past. If you find peace in these deep, unfiltered explorations, and if you wish to connect with the raw, profoundly human side of history, I have created a dedicated space for us on Patreon. There, I share free podcasts, raw, unblurred video sections of history, and we gather as a warm community of history lovers who appreciate the quiet truth. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Joining us there is a beautiful way to ensure these lost, whispered stories are never truly forgotten. He would finish the letter to his mother, a single tear often blurring the final word on the page, and he would carefully set it aside to dry. Then, he would draw a fresh sheet of paper from the stack, dip his pen once more, and begin another. "My sweet sister," he would write. When he wrote to her, the words carried a different kind of sorrow. He wrote to the memory of a girl with ribbons in her hair, a girl who used to chase him through the tall grass in the summers before the world went mad. He wrote about the profound, confusing divide that had fractured their country, and inevitably, their family. He tried to explain to the silent page how the uniform had slowly swallowed him. He wrote about the creeping, terrifying realization that the grand promises of the regime were built on a foundation of absolute cruelty. He wanted her to understand why he had run. He needed her to know that he was not a coward, but a man who had suddenly woken up in a nightmare and chosen to flee toward the light. He wondered, as his pen scratched against the paper, what she believed now. Had she embraced the darkness? Did she wear the crisp uniforms of the youth groups, her arm raised in salute to the very men he had escaped? The thought was a physical pain in his chest. Families all across the continent were being torn apart not just by borders and battle lines, but by the insidious, creeping poison of ideology. He wept for the sister he remembered, and he wept for the stranger she might have become. He wrote to her about the forgiveness he had found in the English village. He told her about the old farmer who had offered him a seat by the fire, and the widow who had shared her rationed tea. He wrote these things in the desperate, foolish hope that if he could just explain it clearly enough, the love and humanity he had rediscovered here might somehow transcend the distance and heal the hatred spreading across their homeland. He would write until his hand cramped, until the muscles in his fingers ached and the small glass bottle of ink was nearly empty. He would pour every unspoken fear, every fragile hope, and every ounce of his crushing guilt onto the scattered pages covering the small wooden desk. For an hour, or perhaps two, the room under the eaves was not a hiding place. It was a confessional. It was a sanctuary of truth in a life built entirely of lies. When he could write no more, when the candle had burned down to a short, sputtering stump of wax, he would carefully gather the pages. He would hold them in his hands, feeling the physical weight of his own heart resting in his palms. He would read through them one last time, his eyes tracing the familiar loops and lines of his native language, silently sending the words out into the dark, hoping against hope that the universe might somehow deliver the sentiment, even if it could not deliver the paper. And then came the most agonizing part of the ritual. He would take the first page, the letter to his mother, and hold the corner of it directly over the candle flame. He watched as the crisp white paper began to curl and brown. He watched as the golden fire ate the ink, consuming his love, his apologies, and his longing. The flame would climb the page, casting a sudden, bright glow over his tear-streaked face. When the fire neared his fingertips, he would drop the burning paper into the empty, cold porcelain basin of his washstand. He did the same with the letter to his sister. He watched the words turn to ash, one by one. The smell of burning paper would fill the small attic, a scent of finality and absolute loss. He stood over the basin, watching the glowing orange edges of the embers slowly fade into the dark, turning from a vibrant, living heat into fragile, lifeless gray dust. When the last ember had died, he would reach into the basin with his bare hands and crush the ash, grinding the remnants of his true self into a fine, unrecognizable powder. He would open the small dormer window, the freezing night air rushing into the room, stinging his eyes. He would gather the ashes in his palm, hold his hand out into the dark, and let the wind take them. He watched the gray dust swirl into the misty air, catching the pale moonlight for a fraction of a second before vanishing entirely into the night. He imagined the wind carrying the ashes eastward, across the quiet English hills, across the churning, freezing water of the Channel, all the way back to the pine forests and the cobblestone streets of his youth. It was a ghost of a message, an invisible embrace sent across the front lines of a burning world. He would close the window, sealing out the cold, and turn back to the room. The desk was empty again. The ink was kept. The pen was wiped clean. The ritual was complete. He would blow out the remaining stump of the candle, plunging the room back into absolute darkness. He would lie down on his narrow iron bed, pulling the rough woolen blanket up to his chin. He was exhausted, drained of every emotion, hollowed out by the quiet tragedy of his own survival. But as he closed his eyes, listening to the gentle, steady breathing of the sleeping village around him, a profound and necessary resilience settled into his bones. The letters were gone, but the love that had written them remained. He could not speak his truth, he could not claim his family, but he could hold them safely in the deepest, most protected corners of his heart. He was a man living a lie, but his love was entirely, fiercely real. And in a world consumed by hatred and destruction, keeping that love alive, even in complete secret, even if the words could only ever be spoken to the fire, was its own quiet, beautiful form of everyday heroism. He let out a long, slow breath, surrendering to the dark, and let the memory of his family cradle him into sleep. There is a profound, terrifying beauty in watching the stars rearrange themselves to make way for the machines of men. The winter finally broke, leaving the English valley bathed in the soft, pale light of a hesitant spring. The frost melted from the cobblestones, the hawthorn hedges began to bloom with tiny white flowers, and the air lost its biting edge, smelling once again of damp earth and growing things. It was a time of rebirth, a gentle unfurling of life that should have brought peace to the quiet village. But the war was entering a new, roaring phase, and the sky above them was no longer their own. It began in the late evenings, just as the sun dipped behind the western hills, painting the horizon in bruised shades of purple and gold. The village would fall silent, the daily chores finished, the blackout curtains drawn. But instead of the usual, settling quiet of the night, a new sound would emerge from the south. It started as a low, throbbing vibration, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. A deep, mechanical hum that seemed to make the very air vibrate. He would stand in the small garden behind the boarding house, looking up into the darkening sky. And then he would see them. They came in endless, terrifying waves. Hundreds of Allied bombers, great dark shapes moving with a slow, heavy grace against the twilight. The drone of their engines was deafening, a relentless, roaring tide of metal and fuel, blocking out the stars. They were magnificent, terrible leviathans of the air, carrying the wrath of a wounded world toward the continent. The villagers would stand in their doorways, their faces tilted upward, watching the armada pass. For them, the bombers were a symbol of hope. They were the sound of retaliation, the thunderous promise that the darkness that had terrorized them for years was finally being pushed back. The widow who had lost her son in the air would watch them with tears in her eyes, a complicated mixture of pride and profound sorrow. The blacksmith would nod grimly, recognizing the massive, industrial effort passing overhead. But for the fugitive standing alone in the garden, the sight of the bombers brought a completely different, deeply isolating kind of terror. He knew exactly where they were going. He knew the coordinates they carried. He knew the cities that lay beneath their flight paths. He knew the shape of the rivers that would guide them in the dark, and the ancient cathedrals that would be silhouetted by the flames. They were flying toward his home. He watched the dark shapes disappear into the eastern horizon, leaving a trail of thrumming silence in their wake. He would close his eyes, and his mind, completely unbidden, would cross the channel faster than any aircraft. He imagined the sirens beginning to wail in the streets of his youth, a high, panicked scream tearing through the night. He pictured his mother, her face pale, grabbing a small, packed bag and hurrying down the narrow, dark stairs to the cellar. He imagined the terrified silence of the people huddled together in the damp, smelling the fear in the air, listening to the whistle of falling steel. The cognitive dissonance was agonizing. He had fled a regime of absolute, mechanical cruelty. He knew that the war machine of the fatherland had to be broken, that the darkness had to be stopped at any cost. He understood the terrible, grim necessity of the bombers flying overhead. But ideology and necessity do not make a city burn any less brightly. They do not comfort a terrified child in a cellar. They do not extinguish the deeply rooted love a man holds for the place where he was born. He was standing in the garden of the enemy, safe and unharmed, while his own country was being turned to ash. The guilt was a physical sickness. It twisted in his stomach and made his hands shake. He felt like a coward. He had run from the fire, leaving the innocent people of his homeland to burn in a conflagration started by the men he used to work for. He had purchased his own peace with their suffering. Sometimes, late at night, the horizon to the east would glow with an unnatural, flickering orange light. The village would sleep, completely unaware, but he would stand by his small dormer window, watching the distant sky burn. It was a reflection of the firestorm consuming everything he had ever known. He would stand there for hours, his hand pressed against the cold glass, weeping silently for the beautiful, complicated world he had left behind, a world that was now disappearing forever. The immense scale of the destruction, the sheer volume of the bombers filling the night sky, is something that is difficult to truly comprehend from the quiet safety of the present day. To understand the profound, conflicting emotions of those who live beneath that sky, it is sometimes necessary to ground ourselves in the physical reality of the era. Holding a piece of history, or immersing yourself in its visual representation, can bridge that gap. For those who wish to honor the past and feel the weight of those times, I highly recommend exploring the incredible WWII memorabilia available on Amazon or watching beautifully crafted, historically grounded films like Midway on Prime. It is a powerful way to remember the sheer magnitude of the struggle. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. One evening, as the roar of the bombers began to fade, leaving the village in a heavy, ringing silence, he found the landlady standing next to him in the garden. She was holding a small basket of damp laundry, her face turned toward the fading sound. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped beneath her thick woolen shawl. It's a terrible sound, isn't it? She murmured, her voice carrying none of the triumph he usually heard in the village when the bombers passed. He turned to her, surprised by her tone. It is the sound of the war ending, he offered softly, carefully repeating the sentiment he heard so often in the pub. The landlady sighed, looking down at her rough, hard-working hands. Perhaps, she said quietly. But there are mothers on the other side of that water, too. Mothers who are putting their children to bed, listening to the same sky. It's a terrible thing, what we have to do to each other to find peace. Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. Here, in the heart of the country that had suffered so much, this woman still possessed a profound, beautiful capacity for empathy. She did not see the people on the continent merely as the enemy, she saw them as human beings caught in the same terrifying storm. She recognized the shared tragedy of the burning sky. He looked at her, his heart swelling with a painful, desperate gratitude. In that moment, he felt a sudden, dangerous urge to confess. He wanted to fall to his knees on the damp grass and tell her the truth. He wanted to tell her that he was one of the men from the other side, that he had run from the darkness, and that her gentle empathy was the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. But he remained silent. The mask was a cruel master, but a necessary one. Yes, he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. It is a terrible thing. They stood together in the garden for a little while longer, two quiet figures watching the stars slowly reappear in the wake of the armada. The world was burning, the skies were filled with fire, but in this tiny, hidden corner of the earth, a profound moment of shared humanity had taken root. He realized then that the village had not just given him physical safety, it had given him something much more vital. It had shown him that even in the absolute darkest depths of a global war, the human heart can still remain tender. It can still recognize the suffering of others, regardless of the uniform they wear or the borders that divide them. When he finally returned to his small room under the eaves, the sky was completely dark. The orange glow on the eastern horizon had faded, replaced by the cold, indifferent light of the moon. He lay down on his narrow iron bed, pulling the woolen blanket tight around his shoulders. He knew the bombers would return the next night, and the night after that. He knew his homeland would continue to burn until the regime was finally, utterly broken. He would carry the guilt of his survival, the sorrow for his country, and the terrifying weight of his secret for the rest of his life. But as he closed his eyes, he did not focus on the fire. He focused on the quiet, exhausted voice of the landlady in the garden. He focused on the beautiful, enduring fact that compassion can survive even the most terrifying storms. He let out a long, slow breath, holding onto that thought like a fragile, glowing ember, and allowed the gentle silence of the English village to carry him into sleep. Peace does not arrive like a sudden sunrise, it breaks like a long, terrible fever, leaving the world shivering, exhausted, and miraculously alive. It was a day in late spring when the air in the village fundamentally changed. The morning had begun just like any other, wrapped in the familiar, quiet gray mist of the English countryside. The fugitive was in the small garden behind the boarding house, his hands deep in the damp, cool soil, gently turning the earth around the roots of the emerging climbing roses. It was a simple, grounding task. And then, a sound broke the stillness. It was not the wail of a siren. It was not the heavy, terrifying thrum of bombers passing overhead. It was a voice. The landlady had thrown open the back door, her usually neat apron slightly askew, her hands pressed tightly against her mouth. Tears, thick and fast, were streaming down her lined cheeks. But they were not tears of sorrow. She could not speak. She simply pointed back into the house, toward the parlor, where the warm, amber glow of the wireless radio was humming. He stood up, wiping the dark earth from his hands, and walked slowly inside. The parlor was already filling with neighbors. The baker stood by the door, still holding a wooden flour scoop. The postman had left his red bicycle leaning haphazardly against the front gate. They were all gathered around the small wooden box, listening to the crackling voice of the broadcaster drifting through the static. The words were spoken with a heavy, measured dignity, but underneath them was a tremor of absolute, world-shifting magnitude. The fighting in Europe was over. The regime had surrendered. The long, suffocating nightmare that had consumed millions of lives, shattered continents, and darkened the skies for years had finally, officially ended. The eagle had fallen. For a long moment, the parlor was entirely silent. The news was too vast, too impossibly heavy, for the human mind to immediately process. They simply stared at the radio, as if expecting the small wooden box to somehow take it all back. And then, from the top of the cobblestone lane, a sound rang out that had not been heard in years. It was the heavy, brass voice of the village church bell. During the war, the bells were under strict orders to remain silent, to be rung only in the catastrophic event of an invasion. But now, the bell ringer was pulling the thick rope with every ounce of strength he possessed. The sound was deafening, joyful, and chaotic. A second bell joined in, then a third, until the very air of the valley seemed to vibrate with the ringing bronze. The parlor erupted. The landlady threw her arms around the postman, weeping openly into his shoulder. The baker took off his cap and gave a loud, uneven cheer, his voice cracking with emotion. They spilled out of the house and into the lane, a tide of ordinary people suddenly unburdened of a weight they had carried for so long they had almost forgotten how to stand up straight. The fugitive stood in the doorway, watching them. The sunlight caught the dust motes dancing in the air. He was swept out into the street by the sheer momentum of the crowd. Everywhere he looked, there was a frantic, desperate joy. People were pulling down the heavy, dark blackout curtains that had covered their windows for years, tossing the fabric onto the cobblestones like discarded armor. Neighbors who had quietly shared their meager rations and their private fears were now dancing in the street, holding hands, their faces tipped up toward the bright, unthreatening sky. Suddenly, a woman from the village, a mother whose husband was still somewhere across the sea, turned and threw her arms tightly around the fugitive's neck. She held him in a fierce, trembling embrace, burying her face in his worn woolen coat. "It's over," she sobbed, her voice muffled against his chest. "Thank God, my friend, it's finally over." He slowly raised his hands and placed them gently on her back. He closed his eyes, and a profound, silent weeping overtook him. He was not crying for the same reason she was. His tears were a chaotic, devastating ocean of conflicting truths. He wept because he was safe. The realization crashed over him like a physical wave. The Black Order was entirely, completely gone. The towering, terrifying machinery of ideology that had hunted him, the cold men in leather coats who would have dragged him to his death, the meticulous ledgers that recorded his treason, they were all ashes now. The hunters had been vanquished. He did not have to look over his shoulder anymore. The phantom breath on the back of his neck vanished into the spring air. He was just a man. He was finally, truly, just a man. But alongside that breathtaking relief came a sorrow so deep it felt as though it might pull him under. His homeland was a ruin. The cities of his youth, the quiet pine forests, the cobblestone squares where he had walked with his sister, they were reduced to smoldering rubble. He thought of the millions of souls who had been swallowed by the dark, the faces that haunted his attic room. They would never hear these bells. They would never feel the warmth of this peace. He stood in the center of the cheering English village, wearing the mask of a gentle stranger, feeling the crushing, isolating weight of survivor's guilt. Why was he allowed to breathe the sweet spring air? Why was he standing in the sunlight, enveloped in the kindness of these people, while the world he came from had burned to the ground? He had run away. He had survived by hiding in the shadows, and now the light was almost too bright to bear. History is so rarely a simple story of triumph or defeat. For the people who lived through it, the end of the war was a deeply complicated tapestry of profound relief and unspeakable mourning. The collapse of the regime meant that the hidden realities, the darkest secrets, and the quiet, unseen battles fought behind closed doors were finally beginning to surface. If you are drawn to the complex, hidden layers of the past, and to the human stories that unfold in the shadows of grand historical events, I would love to invite you to join my free email newsletter. When you sign up, I will send you a free copy of my ebook, The Shadow War: 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. Every week, we take a gentle, deep dive into stories of espionage, quiet resilience, and the forgotten secrets that changed the shape of the world. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is a quiet, thoughtful community, and I would be deeply honored to share these forgotten whispers of the past with you. As the afternoon turned into evening, the village did not quiet down. If anything, the joy grew deeper and more rooted. In the center of the village green, the men built a massive bonfire. They piled up broken wooden crates, dry branches, and the hated, heavy fabric of the blackout curtains. When the sun finally set, they touched a match to the base. The flames leapt high into the air, a brilliant, roaring column of orange and gold. For years, fire in the night had meant terror. It had meant destruction falling from the sky. But this fire was different. This fire was a beacon of survival. It cast a warm, dancing light over the faces of the villagers gathered around it, illuminating the tear streaks on their cheeks and the exhausted, beautiful smiles on their lips. The fugitive stood near the back of the crowd, the heat of the bonfire warming his face. Someone pressed a small glass of hoarded whiskey into his hand. He didn't know who it was, it didn't matter. Tonight, the village was one single, breathing entity. He took a slow sip of the golden liquid, feeling the burn trace a line of warmth down his throat. He looked up past the sparks dancing in the smoke, up into the clear night sky. For the first time in years, the sky was completely quiet. There was no mechanical hum. There were no sirens. There were just the eternal, indifferent stars, shining down on a world that was slowly beginning to heal. He watched the firelight play across the faces of his neighbors. The blacksmith, the baker, the widow. They had saved him. They had unknowingly provided a sanctuary for a man who belonged to their greatest enemy, simply by offering him the grace of their ordinary lives. He realized that this was the true victory. The end of the war was not just the signing of papers in a distant city, it was the ability of these people to stand around a fire, completely unburdened by fear, and share a glass of whiskey with a stranger. Late that night, when the fire had burned down to a mound of glowing red embers and the villagers had finally drifted back to their homes, entirely spent by the sheer emotion of the day, he walked slowly back to the boarding house. The cobblestones were quiet again. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. He climbed the creaking wooden stairs to his room under the eaves. He did not light his candle. He did not need to. The moonlight streamed through the uncurtained dormer window, bathing the small room in a soft, silver glow. He sat on the edge of his narrow iron bed. The silence in the room felt entirely different tonight. It was no longer a heavy, oppressive silence, thick with paranoia and ghosts. It was a spacious silence. It was a silence with room to breathe. He reached up and touched his own face. The mask he had worn so carefully, the rigid control he had maintained over every syllable and every expression, felt suddenly loose. He didn't have to take it off all at once. He was still a man with a complicated past living in a foreign land, but he realized that he no longer had to wear it like armor. The war was over. He was simply a man named Thomas, living in an English village. He lay back on his pillow, looking up at the sloping ceiling. The knot of fear that had lived tightly coiled in his chest since the day he left the Black Order began, very slowly, to untangle. His muscles, tense for years, finally melted into the mattress. He thought of his mother and his sister. He hoped, with every fiber of his being, that they had survived the fall. He knew he could never go back to them, but for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future. He imagined growing old in this village. He imagined sweeping the path, drinking tea by the fire, and watching the seasons change without the constant, thrumming dread of discovery. The eagle had fallen, and with its collapse, a single, quiet dove of peace had finally found its way to the window of his attic. He let out a long, shuddering breath, a breath that seemed to carry the weight of the last 5 years out into the night, and as the silver moonlight washed over his tired face, he closed his eyes and slept. You can take a man out of the dark, but it takes 1,000 quiet mornings to finally wash the shadows from his mind. In the years that followed the great celebrations, after the bonfires had burned down to ash and the village had swept the cobblestones clean, a profound and heavy quiet settled over the valley. The war was officially over. The treaties had been signed, the borders had been redrawn, and the monstrous regime across the channel had been dismantled stone by stone. But peace, he quickly discovered, is not a switch that is simply flipped. Peace is a slow, deeply complicated season of the soul. The physical world healed with a beautiful, stubborn swiftness. The cratered roads in the distance were slowly filled. The blackout curtains, once a symbol of constant, thrumming terror, were cut up and repurposed into ordinary things: aprons, dust cloths, simple patches for worn trousers. The village began to slowly welcome back its young men, those who had survived, watching them step off the train with eyes that looked entirely too old for their faces. There were joyful tears, there were quiet, devastating absences, and there was the undeniable, resilient rhythm of a community determined to simply carry on. But for the man living in the room under the eaves, the peace treaty had not yet reached the deepest corners of his mind. He was safe. He knew this logically. The men who would have hunted him for his desertion were gone, their dark order scattered to the winds of history. Yet, his body had not forgotten the geometry of fear. Every morning, when he woke to the soft English sunlight streaming through his dormer window, his first instinct was still to hold his breath. He would lie perfectly still beneath his woolen blanket, listening for the sharp, terrifying bark of a command, or the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots in a courtyard. When he walked down the stairs to the parlor, he still instinctively mapped out the exits. When he sat in the corner of the public house, nursing his dark ale, he always chose the chair that faced the heavy oak door. He had successfully shed the physical uniform of the Black Order years ago, leaving it behind in the freezing mist of his escape. But he was still wearing the uniform of the mind. It was woven from a dense, suffocating thread of paranoia. It had a stiff collar of guilt that made it hard to swallow, and heavy, invisible boots that made him step too carefully, too quietly, as if the very earth might betray him. He was a man who had forgotten how to simply exist without apologizing for the space he occupied. The unwinding of this invisible uniform did not happen in a single, cinematic moment. It happened in fractions of an inch, over years of beautiful, profound mundanity. It happened in the garden. One mild April morning, the landlady, her hair now entirely silver, handed him a small paper packet of tomato seeds. She didn't ask him, she simply pressed them into his palm with a gentle, trusting smile, and pointed toward a small, sunlit patch of earth near the back stone wall. He knelt in the damp, fragrant dirt. He used his bare hands to break up the clods of soil, feeling the cool, rich life of the earth beneath his fingernails. For years, his hands had been tools of a sterile, bureaucratic cruelty. They had moved paper. They had stamped decrees. They had lived entirely in the abstract, disconnected from the very human consequences of their actions. Now, he was pressing tiny, fragile seeds into the ground. He was carefully watering them with a tin watering can. He was watching, day by day, as a tiny loop of green bravely pushed its way up toward the light. The act of growing something, of nurturing life instead of hiding from it, acted as a slow, miraculous solvent on his guilt. When the first small, green tomatoes appeared on the vine, he stood back and wept. They were tears of pure, uncomplicated wonder. He was allowed to create. He was allowed to be part of the living world again. As the season cycled from the damp chill of winter to the golden haze of summer, his mind slowly began to absorb the reality of his safety. The village had long ago stopped seeing him as a stranger. He was no longer the quiet man from the north. He was simply Thomas. He was the man who could fix a broken gate latch with effortless grace. He was the man who helped the baker carry his heavy sacks of flour on Tuesday mornings. He noticed, with a quiet sense of awe, that he had stopped dreaming in his native language. The harsh, clipped consonants of the fatherland began to fade from his subconscious, replaced by the soft, rolling cadence of the English countryside. The faces of his old commanders, the ghosts that used to crowd the corners of his attic, began to lose their sharp edges. They became blurred, like old photographs left out in the sun, until eventually he could barely recall the sound of their voices. This slow, delicate unspooling of a traumatized mind is a deeply private journey, one that leaves no grand monuments or written records. It is the invisible history of the human heart, mending itself in the quiet spaces between the years. Piecing together these fragile, emotional landscapes requires an immense amount of care, research, and dedication, gently sifting through the echoes of the past to find the humanity underneath. If you find peace in these softly told stories, and if you would like to help support the massive time it takes to craft them, I would be so incredibly grateful if you considered leaving a small tip on my Ko-Fi page. It is a humble gesture that allows me to keep finding the light in the shadows of history. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Knowing there is a community of kind souls walking this quiet path with me makes every hour of writing a profound joy. The true measure of his healing did not come in a grand epiphany, but in a moment so spectacularly ordinary that it almost went unnoticed. It was a rainy November afternoon. He was in the boarding house kitchen, helping the landlady wash the tea things. The room was warm, filled with the scent of soapy water and baking apples. He reached for a delicate china saucer, his hands wet and slick with suds. The saucer slipped from his grasp. It hit the stone floor with a sharp, shattering crack, breaking into a dozen jagged pieces. For a fraction of a second, the old instincts flared. The uniform of the mind tightened its grip. The breath caught in his throat, his shoulders instantly braced for a scream, for a harsh reprimand, for the cold, terrifying punishment that mistaken failure had always brought in his past life. He froze, his eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the blow. But the blow never came. Instead, the landlady simply sighed, a soft, untroubled sound. "Oh, dear," she murmured, wiping her hands on her apron. "That was the chipped one anyway, Thomas. Don't you worry yourself. The broom is just behind the larder door." He opened his eyes. He looked at the shattered porcelain on the floor, and then he looked at the kind, unbothered face of the older woman. She wasn't angry. She wasn't suspicious. She was just a woman needing a broom. The realization washed over him like a warm, cleansing rain. He was allowed to make a mistake. He was allowed to drop a plate, to stumble, to be entirely, imperfectly human, and it did not mean the end of the world. His life was no longer balanced on the razor's edge of a flawless performance. He walked to the larder, retrieved the wooden broom, and quietly swept up the pieces. As he threw the broken china into the bin, he felt an immense, physical weight lift from his shoulders. The invisible collar unclasped. The heavy boots dissolved. He was no longer a fugitive pretending to be ordinary. He had actually, miraculously, become ordinary. That evening, he went for a walk through the village. The rain had stopped, leaving the cobblestones shining like dark mirrors reflecting the soft yellow glow of the lamps in the cottage windows. In the past, he would have walked close to the stone walls, keeping his head down, blending into the shadows, terrified of drawing the eye of a passerby. But tonight, he walked right down the center of the lane. He let his shoulders drop. He lifted his head, breathing in the scent of wet peat and autumn leaves. He listened to the sound of his own footsteps, no longer trying to muffle them. He passed the public house. Through the thick, leaded glass window, he could see the warm fire roaring in the hearth. He saw the blacksmith and the old farmer, raising their glasses in a toast. He didn't feel the sudden, panicked urge to hide his face. He felt a deep, abiding warmth. Those were his friends. This was his village. He continued up the hill, toward the small stone church that sat at the edge of the valley. He stood by the low stone wall of the churchyard, looking out over the rolling landscape, bathed in the ethereal, silvery light of the moon. He thought of the man he had been when he first crossed the freezing channel, a terrified, fractured soul, running from the darkest room in the world, carrying a lie that he thought would eventually crush him. He had spent years waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the shadows to catch up and pull him back into the dark. But the shadows had faded. The sun had risen, and risen again, and the simple, enduring kindness of this English village had gently, relentlessly loved the fear out of him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his hands, resting them on the cold, rough stone of the wall. They were no longer the trembling hands of an SS officer. They were the calloused, steady hands of a gardener. They were the hands of a man who belonged exactly where he was. The night breeze picked up, rustling the bare branches of the ancient yew trees in the churchyard. It was a gentle, soothing sound, like the earth itself taking a long, slow breath. The uniform of the mind was finally gone, carried away by the passing years, leaving nothing behind but a quiet, deeply grateful man, standing peacefully under the open sky. The deepest kind of love is sometimes found in the words we choose never to say. Time is a quiet, relentless river, and over the decades, it slowly smoothed the sharp edges of the man who had once fallen from the sky of a burning world. The English village had aged gracefully around him, the ivy growing thicker on the stone walls, the cobblestones worn a little smoother by the passage of countless, peaceful days. He was an old man now. The dark hair that had once been hidden beneath a crisp, terrifying cap was now a soft, sparse white. The hands that had once trembled with the fear of discovery were now spotted with age, their movements slow and deliberate, the knuckles swollen with the damp chill of countless English winters. The frantic, suffocating paranoia of his early years in the valley had long since melted away, replaced by a gentle, wistful twilight. He was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of the community. He was a beloved fixture, a quiet grandfather to children who had never known a world at war. Yet, even in the absolute safety of his twilight years, the secret remained. It was a heavy, ancient stone resting at the very bottom of his soul. It was a late autumn evening, the kind of night where the wind howled down from the moors, rattling the window panes and sending dry leaves skittering across the dark lanes. He was sitting in the familiar, cozy parlor of the widow's cottage. She, too, had grown old, her once silver hair now a pure, brilliant white, her frame fragile and bent like a delicate willow branch. They had spent hundreds of evenings exactly like this, two solitary souls finding a quiet, enduring companionship by the warmth of a crackling hearth. The room smelled of wood smoke, old paper, and the sweet, dark tea they drank from thin porcelain cups. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with a slow, mesmerizing rhythm, a steady heartbeat measuring out the peaceful remainder of their lives. As he sat in his velvet armchair, watching the orange flames dance in the fireplace, a profound and sudden heaviness settled over him. It was not the cold grip of fear, but the deep, melancholic pull of a life nearing its end. When a man feels the winter of his life drawing to a close, a desperate, fundamental yearning begins to bloom within his chest. It is the desire to be fully, completely known. To leave this earth without a mask. He looked across the small wooden table at his dearest friend. Her eyes were closed, her head resting back against the cushions as she listened to the wind outside. She knew his favorite book. She knew how he took his tea. She knew the exact, quiet way he laughed when a joke pleased him. But she did not know his true name. She did not know the language his mother had sung to him. She did not know the dark, terrible uniform he had once worn, or the immense, sweeping tragedy he had fled. He wanted to tell her. The urge rose up in his throat, sudden and powerful, like a tide pulling at the shore. He wanted to reach across the table, take her fragile, wrinkled hands in his, and lay the final piece of his armor down upon the rug. He wanted to say the words he had buried for a lifetime. He wanted to confess the shadows of his past, not to ask for absolution, but simply to offer her the ultimate truth of who he was. He wanted one person in this world to know the entire, unbroken story of his heart before it finally stopped beating. He rehearsed the words in his mind, feeling the strange, forgotten syllables of his native tongue pressing against the back of his teeth. He imagined starting at the very beginning. He would tell her about the snow in the pine forests of his youth. He would tell her how the darkness had crept over his country so slowly that they had not realized they were trapped until the doors were already locked. He would explain the terrifying machinery of the Black Order, the quiet, bureaucratic cruelty he had been a part of, and the agonizing, shattering moment his conscience had finally woken up. But as he imagined telling her this truth, he watched the soft, peaceful lines of her sleeping face. To understand the immense weight of what he was considering, one must remember the absolute, unvarnished horrors of the world he had left behind. The reality of the continent during those dark years was a brutal, merciless storm of suffering that stood in jarring, unimaginable contrast to this cozy, firelit parlor. The sheer, raw truth of what happened in the shadows is something that is often difficult to grasp from the safety of the present. For those who wish to look directly at history without the softening filters of time, to truly comprehend the terrifying forces this man had fled, I have gathered a collection of unseen, raw, and completely uncensored images and videos of the war. They are secured on a private Gumroad page, offering a profound, unfiltered window into the past. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is a sobering reflection, but one that highlights the miraculous nature of the peace he eventually found. He stared into the embers, the firelight reflecting in his watery eyes. If he spoke the truth now, if he poured out the dark reality of his past, what would happen to the woman sitting across from him? She had lost her only son to the very regime he had served. She had spent her entire life knitting a blanket of forgiveness and grace over her own profound grief. If he confessed, he would not just be telling a story, he would be dropping a devastating anchor into the quiet waters of her soul. He imagined the confusion in her kind eyes. He imagined the shock, the terrible, disorienting realization that the man she had welcomed to her hearth, the man she had trusted and loved like a brother, had been a part of the machine that tore her world apart. He knew, deep down, that she would eventually forgive him. Her heart was vast enough, her spirit gentle enough, to understand his flight and his redemption. But the forgiveness would cost her. It would force her to reconcile the gentle friend she knew with the terrifying enemy she had feared. It would taint her memories of their quiet evenings. It would bring the war, a war that had ended decades ago, rushing back into her living room with a violent, emotional force. He realized, with a quiet, heartbreaking clarity, that a confession at this stage of life was not an act of intimacy. It was an act of profound selfishness. He wanted to clear his own conscience, to feel the relief of laying down his burden, but the price of that relief would be paid entirely by her. He would be handing her a heavy, jagged stone just so he could walk away with empty hands. The wind outside shrieked, rattling the glass in the window frames. The widow stirred, opening her eyes. She smiled at him, a warm, soft expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "You are very quiet tonight, my dear," she murmured, her voice thin and raspy with age, yet still carrying the musical cadence he had loved for so many years. He looked at her. He looked at the photograph of her son, still resting on the mantelpiece, the silver frame now slightly tarnished by time. He looked at the porcelain teacups, the faded floral rug, the entire, beautiful sanctuary they had built together out of shared loneliness and unspoken understanding. The words of confession were right there, resting on the very tip of his tongue. He took a slow, deep breath. The air smelled of applewood and lavender. He swallowed. He forced the words back down, deep into his chest. He pushed the strange syllables of his native tongue away, locking the door on the Black Order, the snow, and the terrible uniform once and for all. He watched his own desire to be fully known turn to ash and drift away into the quiet corners of his mind. "I was only listening to the wind," he said softly, his English perfectly formed, holding the gentle, rolling accent of the village he had adopted as his own. He reached across the small table. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the immense, invisible weight of the sacrifice he had just made. He gently covered her frail, wrinkled hand with his own. "I was thinking," he continued, his voice a low, soothing whisper, "about how incredibly fortunate I am. To have found my way to this place. To have found such a dear, wonderful friend in the storm." The widow smiled, turning her hand over to gently squeeze his fingers. Her touch was warm, and light as a feather. "We found each other, Thomas," she said softly, using the name he had invented, the name he had made entirely real through decades of quiet kindness. "That is the greatest blessing of growing old. We do not have to be alone." He nodded, a single, solitary tear slipping from his eye and tracing a slow path down his withered cheek. She thought it was a tear of gratitude, a sentimental overflow of an old man's affection. She did not know it was the physical manifestation of a beautiful, tragic surrender. He had chosen the silence. He had chosen to remain a ghost in his own history, to die with a fabricated name, in order to protect the peace of the woman who had saved his soul. It was the absolute, highest form of love he could imagine, to carry a lie to the grave so that someone else could live in the truth of their own happiness. They sat together as the evening wore on, the silence between them comfortable and deep. The fire slowly burned down from leaping orange flames to a soft, glowing bed of red embers. The grandfather clock continued its steady, reassuring tick. He felt a profound, settling peace wash over him. The urgency to confess had completely vanished, leaving behind a calm, quiet acceptance. His secret would remain unspoken forever. It would be buried with him under the damp English soil, fading into the earth, never to trouble the waking world again. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the velvet chair. He did not need her to know the darkness he had come from. It was enough that she knew the light he had found. It was enough that he had learned how to love, how to be gentle, and how to protect the things that were fragile. As the last ember in the hearth pulsed with a warm, fading glow, the man who had once been a shadow of the Black Order drifted into a quiet, dreamless sleep, enveloped entirely in the love of a lie that had finally, beautifully, become the truth. There is a profound, quiet grace in watching a single, fragile leaf finally let go of the branch it has clung to for so long. The village was draped in the rich, heavy gold of late October. It was a time of year when the air turned incredibly crisp, carrying the comforting, sharp scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and crushed apples. The great oak trees that lined the winding cobblestone lanes had turned magnificent shades of amber and rust, dropping their leaves in slow, lazy spirals to blanket the ground. For the man the village knew as Thomas, autumn had always been a season of reflection. But this autumn felt different. It felt like an arrival. He was an old man now. The passage of decades had slowly, gently transformed him. The dark, immaculate hair that had once been hidden beneath the terrifying cap of the Black Order was now a soft, sparse white. The shoulders that had once been held in a rigid, military posture were now curved, stooped by the gentle, inevitable weight of time. He walked with a wooden cane, its handle polished smooth by years of his touch. His steps were slow and measured, but they no longer carried the frantic, breathless caution of a hunted fugitive. They were simply the steps of a man who was no longer in a hurry. He lived in a small, stone cottage near the edge of the village, a place of his own, surrounded by a garden he had tended for half a century. On this golden afternoon, he stepped out of his front door, wrapping a thick, worn woolen cardigan tighter around his frail chest. He walked down the lane, the fallen leaves crunching softly beneath his leather boots. The village had changed, as all places do. The cobblestones had been patched, the bakery had a new painted sign, and the children who now played near the churchyard were the grandchildren of the men and women who had first welcomed him in from the cold. Yet, the soul of the valley remained exactly the same. It was still a sanctuary of quiet, enduring peace. He made his way to the village green, finding his favorite wooden bench beneath the oldest oak tree. The wood of the bench was deeply weathered, silvered by countless rains and summers. He sat down slowly, letting out a long, quiet sigh as he rested his hands on the crook of his cane. He watched the wind move through the high branches, shaking loose a shower of golden leaves. He watched them drift and dance before finally coming to rest on the damp, green grass. He realized, with a profound and peaceful clarity, that he was much like those leaves. He was in the deep, fading autumn of his days. The vibrant, chaotic summer of his youth, and the dark, terrifying storms of his past, had all given way to this quiet, golden twilight. The winter of his life was approaching, and for the first time, he did not feel afraid of the cold. As he sat there, bathed in the pale afternoon sunlight, a familiar, philosophical question settled softly into his mind. It was a question he had carried for 50 years, turning it over and over in his heart like a smooth river stone. Is it enough? He looked back on his life in this valley. 50 years of mending broken gates for his neighbors. 50 years of leaving baskets of fresh tomatoes from his garden on the doorsteps of those who were sick. 50 years of tipping his hat to the postmistress, of sitting quietly in the back pew of the church, of offering a gentle, encouraging smile to every child who crossed his path. He had spent half a century trying, with every single breath, to be a man of absolute, unwavering kindness. He looked down at his own hands. The skin was paper-thin now, dotted with age, the blue veins standing out like delicate rivers. These were the hands that had once held deportation orders. These were the hands that had stamped documents in the darkest, coldest hallways the world had ever built. Did a half-century of quiet, gentle peace balance the scales of the universe? Could a man who once stood in the shadow of the greatest cruelty truly find redemption by simply tending to a small English garden and being a good neighbor? He watched a small brown sparrow land near his boots, tilting its head to look at him with bright, intelligent eyes. He smiled softly. He suspected that true redemption was not a ledger you could balance. It was not a debt you could finally pay off with enough good deeds. Rather, redemption was the daily, unending choice to walk toward the light, even when you knew exactly what the dark felt like. It was the decision to spend the rest of your life cultivating warmth, specifically because you had seen the devastating consequences of the cold. The history of the human soul is rarely written in absolute black and white. It exists in the beautiful, painful shades of autumn gray, in the quiet, private struggles of ordinary people trying to mend what is broken. Exploring these raw, unfiltered, and profoundly human corners of history is why I do this work. It is why I believe so deeply in preserving the truth of the human experience, not just the sanitized versions found in history books. If you find peace in these deep, thoughtful explorations and want to connect with the raw reality of the past, I have created a dedicated, quiet space for us on Patreon. There, I share free podcasts, raw, unblurred sections of historical video, and we gather as a warm community of history lovers who appreciate the quiet truth. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Joining us there is a beautiful way to ensure these delicate, whispered stories are never lost to time. The afternoon sun began to dip lower behind the rolling hills, casting long, stretching shadows across the village green. The air grew noticeably cooler, carrying a sharp, invigorating chill. He pulled his knitted scarf a little higher around his neck. He thought of the people he had loved and outlived. The kind widow who had shared her precious rationed tea with a trembling stranger had been resting in the quiet earth of the churchyard for many years. The blacksmith, whose massive presence had once shielded him from the eyes of a suspicious soldier, was gone. The landlady who had given him a room under the eaves, and the old farmer who had offered him a seat by the pub fire, had all faded into the gentle history of the valley. He was one of the last remaining threads connecting the village to that era of shadows and survival. He realized, with a sense of quiet awe, that he was also the last custodian of his own extraordinary secret. When he was gone, the truth of the fugitive who crossed the freezing channel would vanish entirely with him. The Black Order would have no more ghosts haunting this green valley. The lie he had lived, the carefully constructed mask he had worn to protect these innocent people from the monster he used to be, would transform, seamlessly and permanently, into the only truth that mattered. History would not record that an officer of a dark regime lived and died in this village. History would only record that an old man named Thomas lived here. A man who grew excellent tomatoes, who swept the autumn leaves from the path, and who loved his neighbors with a quiet, desperate devotion. And perhaps, he thought, as the wind rustled the branches above him, that was exactly as it should be. The village had never needed him to be a saint. They had never needed a grand, dramatic confession or a theatrical display of lifelong penance. They had simply needed a neighbor. They had needed someone to share the quiet burdens of everyday life. By accepting their love, and returning it as purely as he knew how, he had created a tiny, unbreakable sanctuary of peace within a world that had so desperately needed healing. He did not need the universe to declare him forgiven. He had forgiven himself, and he had been forgiven 1,000 times over by the ordinary, beautiful kindness of the people who waved to him every morning. He rested his chin on his hands, leaning on his walking stick. A single, golden oak leaf drifted down from the canopy above, spiraling lazily in the cool air, before landing softly on the sleeve of his woolen cardigan. He did not brush it away. He looked at it closely, tracing the delicate, intricate veins that carried the story of its long life in the sun. It was incredibly fragile, its edges curled and dry, its color fading into a beautiful, muted brown. Its time had come to return to the earth, to dissolve into the soil and nourish the roots of the tree for the generations to come. It was a quiet, perfect surrender. He slowly stood up from the bench, his joints stiff, complaining softly against the autumn chill. But his spirit felt incredibly, miraculously light. The heavy stone of guilt he had carried in his chest for over half a century had finally worn away to nothing. He began the short, familiar walk back up the lane toward his cottage. The wind swept through the trees, a soft, whispering applause for a day well lived. The chimney of his small house was already sending a thin, welcoming ribbon of white smoke into the darkening sky. The winter was coming, he knew. Soon, the heavy snows would fall, covering the cobblestones and the thatched roofs, wrapping the entire valley in a deep, silent slumber. The days would grow short, and the nights would grow long and bitterly cold. But as he opened his garden gate, the hinges offering a familiar, comforting squeak, he smiled. He was not afraid of the winter. He had survived the darkest, coldest storms the world could offer, and he had found his way to the light. He had a warm fire waiting for him on the hearth, a kettle resting on the stove, and a heart that had finally, beautifully, learned exactly how to rest. The earth is the final, perfect keeper of all our fragile human secrets. It happened in the deep, silent heart of winter, during a week when the snow fell so thick and soft that it muffled the sound of the church bells and turned the village into a world of pure, untouched white. He had lived a long, quiet life in the valley, borrowing a name and building a soul from the gentle scraps of kindness he found around him. But even the longest winters eventually coaxed the final leaf from the branch. He did not pass away in the grip of fear, nor did the ghosts of his past return to crowd his bedside in the end. He simply went to sleep. The fire in his small stone hearth had burned down to a pile of soft, glowing ash, radiating a gentle warmth through the cottage. The grandfather clock ticked its steady, reassuring rhythm in the corner. He pulled his woolen blankets up around his shoulders, closed his eyes, and drifted away on the quietest breath, slipping out of the world as silently as he had once slipped across the freezing channel. It was the baker's son who noticed first. The morning air was bitter and crisp, and as the young man walked past the low stone wall of the cottage, he saw that the chimney was dark. There was no thin, welcoming ribbon of peat smoke rising into the pale winter sky. When they gently pushed open his heavy wooden door, they found him looking entirely at peace. The deep lines of worry that had once etched themselves into his face were gone, smoothed away by the ultimate, profound stillness. The village grieved, not with the loud, public pageantry of state funerals, but with the intimate, heartbreaking sorrow of losing a beloved fixture of their daily lives. The women of the village came to his cottage to wash him and dress him in his best suit, a simple, worn tweed that smelled faintly of lavender and pipe tobacco. They moved through his small rooms with a hushed reverence, gathering his few earthly possessions. If they had been searching for the truth, they would not have found it. They opened his wooden chest and found no dark uniform, no silver insignias, no letters bearing the harsh stamps of the Black Order. They found only the artifacts of the man he had chosen to become. A collection of smooth river stones he had picked up on his walks. A well-worn book of English poetry. A pair of gardening gloves stained with the rich, dark soil of the valley. The mask had not simply been a disguise. Over the decades, it had become the very fabric of his reality. He had left behind no grand manifestos, no confessions hidden under the floorboards. He left behind only the memory of a quiet man who had always remembered to ask after the postman's aching knees, and who grew the sweetest tomatoes in the county. Physical objects possess a unique, heavy gravity. They anchor us to the human hearts that beat so frantically during the dark years of the past. The things we leave behind, a worn coat, a cracked teacup, a photograph, tell the true, unfiltered stories of who we were and the era we survived. Touching the tangible history of that time, or immersing yourself in its visual reality, is a profound way to understand the unimaginable weight carried by that generation. If you wish to connect with this history and honor the reality of the past, I highly recommend exploring the authentic WWII memorabilia available on Amazon, or watching beautifully grounded films like Midway on Prime. These physical and visual reminders help us keep the reality of history alive. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The morning of the burial was draped in a soft, freezing mist. The villagers gathered in the ancient churchyard, their breaths blooming in small, white clouds in the chill air. The yew trees, centuries old, stood as silent guardians over the weathered, leaning headstones of generations past. 6 men from the village, the blacksmith's son, the baker, 2 farmers, and the local constable, carried his simple wooden casket on their shoulders. They walked with a slow, measured grace, the snow crunching softly beneath their heavy boots. They brought him to a plot near the edge of the churchyard, under the sprawling branches of a massive oak tree. The gravedigger had worked since dawn, turning the dark, damp English soil, parting the earth to make room for a man who had been born 1,000 miles away. The vicar, a kind man with a soft, trembling voice, stood at the head of the grave and opened his worn leather prayer book. He spoke of Thomas. He spoke of a life lived quietly, of a man who had sought refuge from the storms of the continent and had found a home among them. He spoke of his gentle nature, his willingness to lend a hand, and the simple, enduring peace he had brought to their community. As the vicar spoke, a profound and beautiful irony settled over the snowy churchyard. Here, resting in a simple wooden box, was a man who had once stood in the very epicenter of the enemy's dark machine. He had been a part of an order that sought to crush this island, a regime that had filled the skies with fire and the seas with terror. And yet, the very people he had been taught to destroy were now weeping for him. They had woven wreaths of winter holly and dark green ivy to lay upon his coffin. They were standing in the freezing mist, bowing their heads, praying for the peaceful rest of his soul. Love, in its purest, most unassuming form, had completely conquered the shadows. The rope strained softly against the wood as the casket was gently lowered into the dark earth. The sound of the first handful of soil striking the lid was a soft, hollow thud, the final, definitive closing of a door. The earth of the churchyard did not judge him. It did not ask for his true name, nor did it demand to see his papers. The English soil received him exactly as it received the sons of the village who had fallen on distant battlefields. It folded him into its dark, quiet embrace, offering the ultimate sanctuary. The earth levels all men, erasing the borders they fought over and the uniforms they wore, leaving only the quiet dust of what they were. After the service, the villagers slowly drifted back to their warm cottages, seeking the comfort of their hearths, leaving the churchyard to the winter silence. Months later, when the snow had melted and the first green shoots of spring were pushing through the damp soil, a small, modest headstone was placed at the head of the grave. It was carved from local gray stone, simple and unadorned. It bore the name he had borrowed from the mist so many years ago. Below it, a single line of text was carved into the rock, "A quiet friend. Found peace in this valley." There was no mention of the war. There was no mention of the Black Order, or the flight across the dark sea, or the paralyzing fear that had once ruled his every waking moment. The stone simply recorded the truth of the life he had chosen to live, rather than the life he had been forced to flee. And so, the greatest secret the village had ever held remained completely safe, buried forever beneath the roots of the oak tree. He had successfully vanished from the history of a terrible regime, trading a legacy of darkness for a legacy of absolute, unbroken peace. As the twilight deepens over the valley, and the shadows grow long across the cobblestones, the village sleeps. The wind whispers through the ancient yew trees, rustling the ivy that slowly climbs the gray stones of the churchyard. It is a gentle, soothing sound, a lullaby for all the weary souls resting in the dark. The mask is finally laid to rest. The fugitive has stopped running. The man who fell from a burning world has become a permanent, peaceful part of the English earth. And as the last light fades from the sky, leaving the world to the quiet guardianship of the stars, we leave him there, sleeping soundly under the soil. May we all find such a quiet place to rest our burdens. May we all find the grace to choose the light, even when we have known the dark. Sleep well, and find your peace in the quiet night.